Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Double Feature Reviews. I'm Libby.
I'm David.
And today is the 2024 triple feature. What are the 3 films we're talking about today, David?
Okay, so today we are doing Amadeus from 1984, The Prestige from 2006, and Black Swan from 2010.
Right at the top of the episode, I want to make sure to give you guys a heads up for some of the content in these films, which we will be discussing during this podcast. Amadeus and The Prestige contain depictions of suicide, and it's unclear exactly what is happening in Black Swan, but suicide is definitely one of the possibilities for things that happen, along with self-harm and eating disorders and drug abuse. So if now is not the time for you to listen or watch anything to do with those things, I hope to see you later on when you're feeling better. And I also want to let you guys know about the spoiler situation for this podcast. We are going to be spoiling all of these movies. For Amadeus and Black Swan, I think you can still enjoy the films even if you know how they end, especially Amadeus because it's about a real person. But The Prestige really depends on tricking you. They really want to conceal information from you throughout the film.
It is a movie about magicians hiding things from people.
Yeah. So we recommend watching The Prestige at least before listening to this podcast.
If you want to listen to the podcast first, you can.
Look, I spoil myself for everything all the time. I have a very high bar for spoilers. I think I would be upset if I knew the ending of The Prestige before I watched it. So, David, had you seen these movies before?
Yes, I've seen all 3 of these movies. Black Swan, I've only seen once.
Mm-hmm. We watched it together.
We watched it together.
And I threw up later that day. Does
Yes.
that mean something? Yes, it means I ate a lot of very greasy octopus.
That's right.
And got on the metro.
It was some of the better octopus I've had. I'll give it that.
This was early in our relationship, and I ate the octopus to impress you.
I was very surprised.
And I do regret it.
Amadeus and The Prestige, I have both seen many times. I've probably seen Amadeus 5 times, The Prestige between 15 and 20.
Kind of the opposite for me. I believe this is my 3rd time seeing The Prestige. It's possible that it's my 4th, but I think I've only seen it twice. And both of those times were maybe between 5 and 10 years ago, and I think I saw it pretty close to each other.
We watched it together.
So the first time I watched The Prestige was with your family at your house. I think you guys had gotten it from Netflix. Everyone else had already seen it, so you got to watch my fascinated reactions. But it was described to me as a story about 2 dueling magicians. And the image that this conjured in my mind was not stage magicians, but wizards. So I was expecting a very different movie. The story that I thought The Prestige was does actually exist. It is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is both a very long novel and a moderately long miniseries, both of which I've seen and both of which are great.
Is the miniseries good?
I mean, it may not be up to your standards, but I liked it.
Okay. All right. I picked The Prestige to try to impress you, to show you that I was into thoughtful, intricately plotted stories, which I know that you liked.
Interesting. And then Amadeus, I don't think we were trying to impress each other at all because we saw it for the first time separately. And I've seen Amadeus probably over 10 times. I've watched it several times. This, however, is the first time for me, and I think the first time for you, watching the director's cut. Had you seen the director's cut before?
So I've seen the director's cut before. Okay. We've actually watched the director's cut before.
So we watched, air quotes, the director's cut with our industry friends. I know Amadeus well enough that I know what scenes aren't supposed to be in it. So I just skipped through all of the director's cut material because we are anti-director's cut on this podcast.
But we're going to get into it.
So if you want to see Amadeus, it's much easier to find the director's cut nowadays than the theatrical cut. The director's cut is about 3 hours. The theatrical cut is about 2.5 hours. So you want to look for the 2.5 hour version of Amadeus.
I'm remembering the timeline slightly differently than you.
Okay.
I think I watched Amadeus for the first time with you in your house.
Oh, that may be possible.
I think that's the first time, because you told me how much you love it, and I said, yeah, I've been meaning to watch that movie. I heard it was really good. And then you said, it is. We should watch it right now.
Okay.
Then later, I watched it on my own, just trying to remember the movie, and I stumbled into the director's cut online and didn't enjoy the movie as much as when I had watched it with you. So, again, we'll get into it later.
So with that out of the way, David, what did you title this series of 3 films?
My title is My Rival, My Muse, My Killer, Myself.
Deep.
Thank you. Yeah, it's 3 movies, which have a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences. So you're going to have something that has a little built-in ambiguity. But I actually think it covers the right things and it presents the right mysteries.
The title I have chosen is a question. My series title is Devotion Enough? Which I think is a question that all 3 of these films ask, and I think that they all answer it in different ways.
I think it's a very good title. I had some ideas that were similarly about, what is it to be loved by someone, which I think is another theme that's shared by all those movies.
So now if you have decided to listen to this podcast without having watched the movies, David's going to give a little plot introduction, or maybe it's just been a while since you've watched the films, and all of these films have a lot of plot. So it might be nice to have a refresher. David, refresh us.
Please. In Amadeus, a devout composer swears vengeance when his every ambition is upstaged by his idol and rival, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. For the prestige, 2 boundary-pushing magicians engage in a lifelong duel of sabotage and mechanical wizardry that threatens their twisted identities. For Black Swan, the fragile psyche of a sheltered ballet dancer begins to crack when she gets her big break and befriends a rebellious dancer from the same company.
Does it begin when she gets her big break?
Well,
or I might argue it begins before, but we'll get to that when we talk about Black Swan.
The psyche is already fragile, but perhaps a full crack has not yet appeared. Watch out for the glass.
So focusing on Amadeus, which is the one we watched first, this is a 1984 period piece directed by Milos Forman, written by Peter Shaffer, and it is also adapted from a play by Peter Shaffer, which we have seen. We saw the National Theatre's performance of it, starring Lucien Mismati and Adam Gillen. And the Shaffer play is originally based on a Pushkin one-act, which I have listened to a radio version of. It stars F. Murray Abraham as Antonio Salieri, Tom Hulse as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Elizabeth Berridge as Constanze Mozart, also called Stanzi. She's his wife.
As Libby mentioned, this was originally a play, and it was a really successful play. Received a lot of acclaim in its time. I don't know, Libby, you know more about plays than me. How big of a splash did this make on the stage?
Yes, this play was a really big deal. Peter Shaffer had already garnered fame for Equus.
Yes, that Equus.
That Equus with the horse. And it had really big name stars when it opened in London. Paul Scofield played Salieri and Simon Callow played Mozart. Simon Callow does appear in this film, but he doesn't get to be Mozart. Sorry, Simon, you weren't famous enough. He plays Emmanuel Schikaneder, who is the librettist for The Magic Flute.
And what is a librettist for those that aren't very familiar with opera?
A librettist is the person who writes the libretto. So operas are do you not want...
As in like the lyrics?
Yes, the words. So opera is written differently than modern musicals tend to be written. So modern musicals, some of them, the words and music are written by the same person. This is generally what Stephen Sondheim did, and he writes them simultaneously. Sometimes you'll get a separate composer and lyricist like Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. And Andrew Lloyd Webber actually writes the tunes first, and then Tim Rice puts words to them. Or at least he did when they were still getting along. The way operas are traditionally composed is a librettist who sometimes works just writing librettos, but may also be a playwright or poet, writes a basically long-form poem that is meant to be performed in dialogue, and then gives it to a composer, or a composer will find one, or maybe a mutual patron will link them up. And then the composer sets the words to music. But back to the play Amadeus. So it opened in London with Paul Scofield and Simon Callow. It very shortly then moved to Broadway with Ian McKellen as Salieri. And I think both Salieri and Mozart are considered like really juicy roles that actors want to play. So this show has been put on multiple times in the past 50 years. Some people who have played Salieri, Frank Langella, Michael York, Rupert Everett, Michael Sheen, who had also earlier played Mozart, as well as Tim Curry, who I think would be a great Mozart, and I'm so sad I didn't see him. And Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker, has also played Mozart.
Yeah, so Mark Hamill was actually almost cast to play Mozart in the movie, as well as Kenneth Branagh, also very, very close to being cast as Mozart. Well, so originally it was going to be Kenneth Branagh. Then Milos decided he wanted to go all-American to avoid any cultural confusion.
Which I like.
I think it was a reasonable choice. I mean, I think it would be good to go either all-British or all-American, rather than cause more confusion.
I agree, and I also think that Brits get enough period dramas, so anyone that us Americans can yoink, we're gonna yoink it, baby.
So then it was going to be Mark Hamill, who I think would have done an excellent job.
I agree.
I think he would have been great. Milos talked about how when he researched Mozart, he saw that all the portraits of him looked different. And there was no public image of Mozart. And so he specifically did not want to bring in a traditional big leading hunky man to play the role. He wanted to pick someone that kind of looked like a normal person. Mark Hamill, definitely could be styled very nicely. I think he would have done a great job in the role. I think he looks a lot like Tom Hulce. Is that how you pronounce it?
I believe
Tom
it
Hulce?
Is pronounced Hulse.
Hulse? Yeah, I'll take your word for it.
I said Hulse for a
Hulse.
long time, but I think I'm wrong.
right,
I think
Hulse.
Hulse is correct.
Tom Hulce is probably most famous outside of this for being one of the lead comedic roles in Animal House, a very different movie. Probably won't be covered on this podcast.
He is
maybe.
Also the voice of Quasimodo
That's true.
in Disney's Hunchbacks of Notre Dame, if you want to hear him sing.
That's right. Those are, I think, the big 3 credits for Tom. Part of the strategy of bringing in Milos as the director is that they wanted to shoot it in Czechoslovakia at several theaters, including the, I'm going to have to look at my notes here, Count Nostitz, which I might not be saying correctly, theater in Prague, where Don Giovanni and La Clemenza di Tito debuted with Mozart as the conductor. Thank you. The actors talked about how that was like a holy experience for them to be standing there where Mozart did the movie. It was shot on a budget of $18 million. It was only in photography for about 6 months in 1983. Released in September 1984. Was successful financially. Had a North American box office of $52 million, a global box office of $90 million, so more than made its money back, but was definitely there as more of a critic's movie than an audience movie. And it was really successful. It won the Best Picture and was nominated for 11 Academy Awards. Milos won for Best Director. F. Murray Abraham won for Best Actor as Salieri. It won for Best Screenplay, Best Costume Design, Best Makeup, Best Sound, Best Art Direction. Did great. Also did very well at the BAFTAs. It did not win Best Film, lost to Woody Allen's Purple Rose of Cairo, but won Best Cinematography, Best Editing, Best Sound. F. Murray Abraham was nominated again as an actor.
And I believe for the Academy Awards Best Actor, Tom Hulce was also nominated. So they were making up almost half of that premier award slot. I'm actually going to say I don't think it should have won for Best Costumes. I love this movie, and I really care about nice-looking costumes. This it is a testament to how good the other elements of this film are that I am willing to overlook some shoddy costume design in order to enjoy it.
Do you feel like they don't look nice or they're not historically accurate? I think most people consider the costumes to look great. I don't know if you agree, or at least vibrant.
They do look vibrant. They definitely blend into this Rococo setting. I think they're using, as you said, a lot of 18th century buildings, which I think they were making very few changes to.
That's right.
So the costumes blend in pretty well with the historically accurate set. Numerous things are quite obviously made out of polyester. And the closures don't always seem to make sense. There's a lot of back closures on women's dresses, which was not what they were doing in the 18th century. And some of the wigs, I don't love all of the wigs. They are pretty clearly constructed to have bangs covering the wig line, which for men's wigs is not something that they would have done. Having your wig look fake was part of fashion for men in the 18th century. You want to look like you can afford a wig. And for women, women were actually generally not wearing full wigs. You would only wear a full wig if you had lost all of your hair. Women were generally incorporating hair pieces into their normal hair, which I know for films can be quite a to-do. So I'm okay with people using wigs on women to do 18th century films, but you gotta do more work to conceal that wig line.
I assume the problem is not with the wig guy.
Sorry?
I assume your complaints about the wigs have nothing to do with the character of the wig guy.
The character of the wig guy is my favorite character in Amadeus. I think he has 3 lines.
Does he have any lines?
He does have lines.
Okay, he does have lines. You're right.
He's, I believe... there are 2 people with accents. There are 2 people who are putting on accents in this film. One of them is an Italian who, part of his character is that he doesn't speak German very well. And he's one of the composers affiliated with Emperor Josef's court. So he's doing an Italian accent. And then the wig guy, who is, I believe, doing a German accent. Maybe it's French.
Maybe he's Czech. I don't know.
But he helps Mozart style one of his wigs and says things like, "Ah ha ha ha, he's funny."
I remember you making what I think was a great point, is that there needs to be an Oscar for Best Cameo.
Yes.
Which I think Wig Guy could have won. And I think there are a couple roles, as I was watching all 3 of these movies, where I thought, it would be nice to have an Oscar for Best Cameo. This is how we fix the Oscars. We don't need to make it more serious. We need more awards. And not joke awards, but more awards that celebrate all the different things that make movies great. So, relax, Oscars.
Anyone can make a compelling character with 100 lines. Can you make a compelling character with 3 lines? That's the challenge.
I think the minimum time is going to be below 8 minutes, because as we all agree, 8 minutes is more than sufficient time to be nominated for Best Supporting. There's no issue there. So when Maurice Jarre, who won the 1985 Oscar for Best Original Score for A Passage to India, in his acceptance speech, he said, "Well, thank goodness I'm not nominated against Mozart," or at least something similar along those lines, kind of implying that maybe the best music that year was in the film Amadeus, which obviously didn't have an original score. It's by Mozart. And I just was thinking at the same time, as you were mentioning the Best Cameo, that there should be an Oscar for Best Adapted Score or something along those lines. Best Soundtrack.
Are posthumous nominations possible? I know that Heath Ledger won after he died for the Joker.
You're
but
right.
Had he already been nominated?
I do not believe he had already been nominated.
Okay,
but I could be
so
wrong.
posthumous nominations are allowed. Give Mozart Best Adapted Score. Although almost all of the score is Mozart's work, there are a couple of pieces by Salieri.
Oh, really?
If we want to consider that as diegetic, you see 2 scenes from one of his operas.
Okay.
If we count that as diegetic,
I don't think we're counting that.
Okay, it's hard to tell which is the
That's
diegetic
fair.
music and which is the non-diegetic music.
I don't think we're counting those, but I think that's a good point. But yeah, I would like to see a Best Score Oscar, and it can go to the producer of the album, even if it's not from a single artist. And there is an upcoming TV series likely to be released in the next 18 months, maybe, which is this adaptation of the same story. So still kicking.
Okay, it's an adaptation of the Schaeffer play adapted for television?
Yes.
Okay. We'll see how that goes.
I wouldn't say my hopes are but so high, but I'm interested.
I'm probably going to watch it.
You tell me how it goes.
And I did want to talk a little bit about the original work, even before the Schaeffer play that this is based on. So to give you a little bit of a timeline, things happen a lot faster than you might have expected. So Mozart dies in 1791. Spoilers for the movie. He and Antonio Salieri had been colleagues and friends. The main thing to know about the film Amadeus is that it is not historically accurate. So if we ever want to talk about the actual Mozart and Salieri, we'll call them the real Mozart and the real Salieri. Any references to the characters Mozart and Salieri are not meant to be aspersions on the actual men.
Yeah, I'm sure it's helped. I know that the movie did help to raise Salieri's prominence a lot and help to bring his music back kind of into some cultural focus. But I'm guessing, the Salieri family and estate might not have been that excited about this basically totally made-up myth about what he did do.
Well, it's not like it was new. So even shortly after Mozart had died, people speculated about whether Salieri had poisoned him. Mozart died at an unusually young age. He was 35. We do have some records of his symptoms. Modern doctors have looked at this and haven't determined one particular cause of death. I think there's a non-zero chance that he was sick with multiple things, and it's impossible to say which one of those finished him off. So even while Salieri was still alive, there was some speculation that he had poisoned Mozart. He has since been exonerated of that. Mozart's symptoms don't appear to be consistent with poisoning. So we really don't think that Salieri actually poisoned him.
In the movie, he doesn't poison him, for
Exactly.
what that's worth.
So Salieri dies in 1825.
Do you know, was he in an asylum? Was he having health problems that he was famous for at that time?
Salieri did attempt suicide at the age of 74. He seemed to be having difficulties with dementia, and he was put in an insane asylum for the last 2 years of his life. The insane asylum is depicted in the film, and they don't really give you the context for that, but this is actually an attempt to save his soul. So suicide by the Catholic Church was considered a sin. And so if you were in your right mind and you attempted suicide, that meant you were condemned to hell. So they were kind of trying to do a bureaucratic workaround with heaven by putting him in an insane asylum and saying, hey, he's not in his right mind, so he didn't commit a sin by attempting to commit suicide. 5 years after Salieri dies, the Russian writer Alexander Pushkin uses these rumors about Salieri poisoning Mozart as the inspiration for a one-act play that he was writing. Totally unrelated, but Pushkin also died unusually young at the age of 37. And Mozart and Salieri is the only play of his that was published during his lifetime. All these tragic 30-something European artists.
Fortunately, that never happens anymore.
Yeah, they're the only two men who've ever died in their 30s.
Yes.
And I don't think Pushkin was at all attempting to make a journalistic piece. He seemed focused on telling a story about envy, and he happened to use some contemporary rumors as the basis for his plot. The Pushkin play, I would say, is most similar. It really reminded me of Edgar Allan Poe in its style. If you want a literary double feature, I might recommend The Cask of Amontillado and Pushkin's Mozart and Salieri. Salieri's got this sort of hand-wringing, mustache-twirling, sort of conniving, I've worked all my life, but now I must make this man pay sort of thing. He's kind of sinister and creepy. And I think F. Murray Abraham, one thing I noticed in the director's cut is that there's nothing direct, but overall the impression is it's a more negative portrayal of Salieri.
Yes.
A lot of the stuff they cut was him impeding Mozart's progress in the court and impeding his ability to get his music performed. In the theatrical release, we really get a sense of Salieri loving this music, but also hating the person of Mozart. So he seems genuinely torn for most of the film, once we get through the inciting incidents, about, whether he wants Mozart to be performed or not. But a lot of these scenes in the middle of the film are included in the director's cut, which is just him being awful.
It seems like the director's cut also really plays up the love triangle or quadrangle that they get. Why can't we just say square, honestly, or rectangle?
I say square.
Okay.
I don't know what you're doing.
All right, great. Very good. The love square that they get involved in with Mozart's wife, Constanza, and as well as Salieri's ingenue, is that the right term for their relationship?
She's his student.
His student.
His singing student.
His singing student, who is later corrupted by Mozart, much to Salieri's disdain. And these things are hinted at. They're part of the plot in the theatrical cut, but they're not really detailed or emphasized in as lurid or graphic a manner.
Yeah. One thing that was added to the film specifically, which is not in the play and not in real life, is Salieri making a vow of celibacy. He says to God, the only thing I want to do is make beautiful music in your honor, and in return, I will be celibate.
I give you my chastity.
I give you my chastity. Salieri in real life was married, had mistresses. In the play, they do talk about his mistress. He's clearly getting it on. I'm not sure why they added it to the film, but it seemed like they then wanted to retract it. So there's meaningful scenes which are about Salieri not having sex that are cut, but it seemed like it was a little bit too integrated in to fully excise it.
I think the goal is sort of to establish the chastity and then show him breaking that chastity as his devolution into madness.
Except that he doesn't. He never has sex with anyone.
Well, he sort of tries to have sex with Constanza and then doesn't.
Yeah, so I was really confused about that scene. So I think maybe it's good that it was cut. Maybe you can give me some enlightenment. So there's a scene maybe a third of the way through. Mozart and his wife are broke because Mozart can't get any pupils that will pay him to teach them piano. Because the Italians in court are sort of against this German composer, he is being forced to submit samples of his work to a committee in order to be able to have the privilege and the position, the salary, of teaching the emperor's sister. Mozart refuses to yield to the Italians and does not want to submit samples of his work because he thinks I'm clearly the best. So Constanza takes some of his work and brings it secretly to Salieri to submit it for committee review. And Salieri looks at it, has this Salieri is sexually attracted to music, is what this film is telling us, not to people. He has all of these ecstatic faces while he's listening or, sort of sight reading.
He's definitely real into it.
Yeah, while he's sight reading Mozart's pieces.
He seems to be pretty interested in women as well.
I don't know. I think he's more in love with music than with women.
I think that's fair.
So Salieri basically, I guess it's implied, but it's pretty clear that he tells Constanza, you need to come back tonight and have sex with me, and then I will approve your husband's position.
Right.
That one line where he tells her to come back that night is cut in the theatrical release, as is the following scene. When she comes back, honestly seems pretty game.
Right.
She's not timid or nervous or angry about it. He's standing there and asks her to undress. She gets maybe 80% of the way undressed, and then he calls in a servant to lead her out.
Right.
I had no idea how to interpret this scene.
Okay.
Was Salieri intending to have sex with her and then changed his mind? And if so, why did he change his mind? Was he never planning to have sex with her and he brought her in to humiliate her, or to sort of secretly know that he has this dirt on Mozart, that he got Mozart's wife to be willing to cheat on him? What's going on with that scene?
Yeah, I think the cinematography really emphasizes that he has a change of mind when he sees Mozart's music. So when she first comes to meet him, she brings him samples of the music, and he looks at the music and, like you say, is just totally overwhelmed by its power. And then when she comes back, maybe he's intending to sleep with her. Maybe he's going to try to, I think he expects her to be more resistant and sort of expects more of a fight, and is sort of going to enjoy the experience of kind of pushing her around and thus further humiliating Mozart. But when it turns out that she doesn't actually see this as that big of a deal and is willing to just go along with it, and then she again offers him the music, and he tries not to look, but it falls open, and he sees the music and is overcome by its power. I think the idea is that he sort of feels reconnected to God all of a sudden, and is ashamed of himself and ashamed of his sin, and it throws her out, partially to embarrass her, but also because, he does not want to be tempted by her, because he realizes how unholy his actions are in comparison to this totally holy music. But yeah, I think it's a good thing the scene was cut. The scene is cut because boobs, and they don't need to deal with that in the rating situation.
This movie ended up being rated PG-13.
Yes.
You do see Elizabeth Barrage's actual breasts, which would have brought it to an R rating.
Definitely at this time.
Yeah.
So that's the reason it's cut. Mm-hmm. And I think Milos is unable to defend this scene in the editing room because it doesn't really make sense. And I don't know, I guess we could maybe just emphasize what you said before about how the director's cut of this movie is not very good. And basically every decision that is made between the theatrical cut and the director's cut is an excellent decision that dramatically improves the movie. And, normally I think it's good when directors are able to produce the art they want to make. They're supposed to be the artists in the business. But, wow, this is one of the most clear-cut cases against doing a director's cut that I've ever seen. There's some great director's cuts out there, and this is definitely not that.
Not one of them. You don't want the Snyder cut, guys. One thing, I'm trying to work out how this scene would fit into sort of Salieri's most important relationship in the film, which is with God. So at that point in the film, Salieri has already declared war on God. So it seems weird that he would be penitent, once he's declared war on God, I think it's really interesting that he continues to keep his promise to never have sex.
I think that's supposed to show him sort of doubting the war that he's declared. I think the scene would work way better if you are going to include it before he really turns against God, and to have that be part of his transition back and forth. Because even when he's waiting for Elizabeth to arrive that night, for Constanza to arrive that night, he's praying to God and saying, oh, just give me a sign, kind of implying, if you give me a sign, then I won't go through with this. So his absolute rejection and anger at God that we see earlier in the movie is sort of too early, and then we go back and we try to take it back. And so that's why I think it's better to have these senses sort of bubbling underneath the scene, because we have a similar situation with his music student, which he apparently is incredibly attracted to, but is not trying to make a move on because he would consider that improper, and he thinks of her as a very innocent young lady, which she's actually not really.
Well, I think it has less to do with her and more to do with his vow to God.
That's right. And so then he sort of tries to keep her from getting involved with Mozart, but he makes too much of a scene, and she goes and applies auditions for his opera and becomes his big new star. And in the movie, there's like one shot in the sort of celebration of his opera at the end where it's implied that they may have had an affair, and Salieri sees this and is really upset about it. And it's a nice, subtle background thing that reinforces the same narrative we know. In the movie, I said. In the theatrical cut.
In the real movie.
In the real movie. In the director's cut, there's this long extended scene where Salieri tries to confront her about it, and she tries to confront him, and the singer tries to confront Mozart's wife, and it's just like, we get it. They had an affair. Salieri is jealous. That is the important part of the story. Can we move on? Yeah,
and so if you haven't seen the film, it is told in flashbacks from Salieri's perspective after he's attempted suicide. It'd be hard to do this after he had committed suicide. A priest is brought to him because, as Salieri attempted suicide, he blamed himself for killing Mozart. So the priest is like, oh, so about that, you didn't really kill him. So we are getting some voiceover of Salieri in 1823 talking about the events of the 1870s and 90s.
The priest doesn't seem to know who Salieri is at all.
That's true. One of the voiceovers in that situation that you were just talking about was, and that's when I knew he'd had her, meaning that's when I realized that Mozart had sex with Madame Cavalieri, his music student.
We knew like 15 minutes ago.
Right. So that line is moved between the director's cut and the theatrical cut. So in the director's cut, we've already had the scene in her dressing room where everyone's talking for a really long time, and Madame Cavalieri is being really mean to Constanza, and Mozart's sort of trying to be nice to both of them. And then we hear this voiceover of Salieri saying, and that's when I knew he'd had her. And I'm like, are you dumb, Salieri? Yeah. That seems very obvious. Yeah. Whereas in the theatrical release, Constanza introduces herself as Mozart's fiancé. Mozart does a nervous giggle because he's standing right next to Cavalieri. And then she throws the bouquet of flowers she'd gotten at Mozart and storms away. And I'm like, that's all we needed. And it makes Salieri seem like a much more intelligent person to put together that Mozart had slept with her just from that incident, as opposed to a 5-minute long conversation.
A lot of the stuff in the director's cut is this more of him talking to the priest and basically reviewing what you just saw in the last few scenes and discussing the themes of it. And It's pretty boring compared to the rest of the movie because it's just two people talking in a room, and B, it's some of the most explicit violations of show don't tell in filmmaking. It's like, okay, we just showed you all of these interesting things and created a really exciting story with clever ways of telling you what's happening with visual storytelling, and now we're going to have two people sit in a room for 5 minutes and just kind of review to make sure we're all on page, and it's boring.
Yeah, the play, the Schaeffer play, does have this sort of flashback, and there's some narration happening from modern day Salieri, 1823 Salieri. There is no priest character in the play.
There's no insane asylum in the play.
There's no insane asylum. So it's all, the narration that he's doing is all right up until he attempts to kill himself.
So the movie has a lot of opera in it. Do you think you need to understand opera or know opera at all to enjoy the movie? Or do you think that anybody who likes movies would like it?
So I had entered my opera era after watching and really loving Amadeus. So I think knowing more about opera can enhance your experience of Amadeus, but I don't think it's necessary to be able to enjoy it in the first place. One of the notes that I noticed you made in our shared document was that you think it's good that you like that Mozart's German language operas are translated into English, because obviously everyone is speaking German all the time, but it's in English because it's an American film.
I feel this is such a key fact that makes the movie good. I'm happy to say more afterwards, but yes, I totally agree with you.
So I would be way more sympathetic to this point if I could actually understand anything that they were saying in the sections. I was not at all familiar with Abduction from Seraglio, one of the German language operas, when I watched Amadeus. I knew a little bit about the other three, Don Giovanni, Marriage of Figaro, and Magic Flutes. I would never have guessed that Abduction from Seraglio was being sung in English in that film. It just sounded like nonsense syllables.
I think that's the one that's very hard to understand. I think that's true. First of all, there's this sort of tension between should the operas be in Italian or should the operas be in German, which is a big part of the plot. It's probably the driest part of the plot. It gets a bit nerdy, honestly. You know, I think we need it to kind of give us some meat to hook onto, and it's not like we actually focus the story on that issue. But it does sort of make the issue real for the audience. Okay, don't you like the plays better when you can sometimes understand what they're saying? That's nice. I think maybe they don't want to give this impression that, like, opera is supposed to be easy to understand, and that would not fit with the way people see opera. They know that when you sing it, it's sung in a very stylized way that isn't easy to understand. So I think that's partially an intentional choice to keep it in a really stylized delivery. But there are several points where they do make a point of trying to make you understand what they're singing. And there's one when they were having this sort of sexy intrigue with the singing student where Salieri is enraged because in the opera that she's singing some very suggestive lyrics about take me or something along those lines.
Oh, I didn't think he was complaining about the content. They complained about the content earlier. He's complaining that she's just singing scales.
I don't think he is complaining about the content, but I think he sees this as just another way in which Mozart is violating the innocence of this woman that he thought was his. And there are a couple other points where you can actually understand what they're saying. You can tell they kind of turn the volume and the crispness up a little bit to make sure that it is comprehensible. I think it maybe would have been more interesting if they tried to make you understand more of the opera. I don't think they actually want you to focus on the story of the opera at all, but more to show Mozart is writing stories with a really strong theme. I think they're kind of almost implying that other operas were more dry and focused on retelling a legend, whereas Mozart's stories have real heart and feelings. I don't know that that's particularly fair, but that's the idea.
The real contrast they're trying to draw is not necessarily between German and Italian language librettos, but between stories about normal people, like Figaro and Susanna, as opposed to stories about ancient heroes like Orpheus or Idomeneo, which is an opera that Mozart wrote and is referenced in the film, but it is not shown in the film.
Yeah, one of my favorite performances in the movie I call him Blue Coat Guy. No idea what his name is.
I call him Dr. Lyman Hall because that actor plays Dr. Lyman Hall in 1776.
Oh, I see. That's him.
And the other, the Kapellmeister, who these are two...
is that the Italian guy?
There's two Italian guys, Count Orsini Rosenberg, who is not using an Italian accent.
Okay.
He wears glasses.
Okay.
And
that guy's Italian.
Kapellmeister Boner.
Not German. I think the guy who wears glasses is German because he tells Franz Josef at the beginning that their new opera should be in German, not in Italian.
You're mixing up Blue Coat Guy with Glasses Guy.
Maybe so.
Anyway, there's two guys from 1776 in this.
I'm mixing up with another guy. You're right. There's several guys. Oh, he's also from 1776.
Yeah, so one of them is the representative from, where's Dr. Lyman Hall from? Georgia?
That sounds right.
And the other guy is the representative from North Carolina.
Okay. Oh, he is the representative from North Carolina. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I watched Amadeus for the first time, like, within 6 months of watching 1776.
Oh, wow.
So I'm like, it's two Amadeus guys.
Yeah.
They're back.
Yeah. Well, Blue Coat Guy is great. And so when they first mention Mozart to the emperor, he says that Il Domineo is the most promising work that he's heard in years. And I'm curious, is that justified? Is Il Domineo actually a groundbreaking opera or anything along those lines?
So first things first, the name is Idomeneo.
Oh, thank you.
It's one word. It's Idomeneus, the Greek hero.
Got it.
I don't think it's groundbreaking.
Okay.
So Mozart wrote that when he was extremely young, maybe like 22. I think what Blue Coat Guy was saying in that line was not this is the best opera I've ever heard, but this is the best opera I've ever heard by a 22-year-old.
Okay.
Yeah, he says promising, not great.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he wants Mozart. He is German and wants more support for a German composer. So I think he is encouraging Emperor Franz Josef to give him patronage, which will then enable him to develop and become a great composer, which he currently isn't. So we're kind of lightly referencing it, but I wanted to make sure that we talked about clearly the two best scenes in this film. This is overall a very good film, but I'm wondering, one of them I think will be obvious. What do you think I'm thinking of as the two really great special scenes in this film?
Well, there are two scenes that really, really stand out, I think, in the traditional appraisal of this movie. So there's one is near the beginning of the movie where Mozart is introduced to the emperor. I mean, we've discussed it before. I think that may be a top 5 movie scene of all time.
Yeah.
That is a truly, for a scene...
It's also when Mozart and Salieri meet for the first time.
That's true. Well, not the first time Salieri sees him, but it is the first time that they meet. For a scene that is actually pretty simple, pretty light, it's not like there's some amazing special effect or shocking moment that happens in the scene, really. It's a very conventional movie scene. It is so perfectly executed and full of so much interesting and exciting detail. So, of course, that's got to be one of them. The other scene that everybody talks about in this movie is at the end of the movie when Mozart is dictating music to Salieri on his deathbed. So I can only presume you're talking about those two. That scene has received a lot of attention, and a lot of people do consider that one of the greatest movie scenes of all time as well. The first scene isn't that popular. I don't think I
think it's more popular than you think. If you want to see this first scene that we're talking about, go to YouTube.
You should watch it.
Go to YouTube and type in Mozart insults Salieri by playing his own music better than him. That is the name of that's the title of
That's an interpretation of the scene for sure.
Yeah. So, oops, my chair made a lot of noise. Focusing on that first scene first, I don't think the cinematography is the greatest or most innovative cinematography that you'll ever see, but the acting and the writing both are like surgically produced. And there's 6 characters in it, and you get a really strong sense of what all of their opinions are, even though they're having to do a lot of lying and sort of playing nice for the court. You also get to hear Mozart sort of live compose Non più andrai from The Marriage of Figaro. I have no idea if that was actually based on a tune by Salieri. What struck me about this scene watching it this time, once you've watched it 12 times, you get to pick up on this. And it might have been that there was some of the director's cut content brought me to this conclusion. So it did do something good. Salieri is kind of in like a childish way, like nervous and excited to meet his idol. Like he he's seen Mozart rolling around on the floor being dirty with Constanza, but I think that is overpowered by how beautiful he thinks Mozart's music is the first time he hears it. And so he really wants to impress Mozart. And I get the impression that he wanted to play this march himself.
Oh, yeah.
And the Emperor, who is not a particularly great piano player, although he's far above average. He does better than, someone who's never played piano would do. The Emperor plays it badly and sort of butchers it in Salieri's mind. And thus kills his attempt at a first impression. And then that also made me think, there's a scene later in the film when Mozart's father, Leopold, has arrived in Vienna attempting to bring Mozart back to Salzburg because he thinks he's spending too much money in Vienna. Mozart insists that they all go out to a party, which his dad doesn't really want to go to. And they're playing musical chairs. And if you lose musical chairs, you have to do a forfeit. And Mozart's forfeit is playing the tune that they were doing musical chairs to in the style of certain composers. Salieri, there in a mask, everyone is masked, asks him to do Salieri. And he puts on this very buffoonish expression and plays the music as though someone who doesn't
overly
really know.
Serious.
Well, I think he's playing the music. I had initially read it as overly serious. This time I was seeing it as someone who doesn't know how to play piano. It seemed to me like he was more doing an impression of the Emperor playing Salieri's march, because we never see, and Mozart never sees in this film, Salieri playing the piano. Actually, we see him do a little tune when he composes this march, but we don't really see Salieri doing music. Yeah, one thing that I was able to pick up in the director's cut that I haven't normally picked up on is that Constanza is maybe lower class than Mozart. I hadn't fully realized that just from the text itself. It is sort of muddled by the fact that the first time we see Constanza when she's rolling around on the floor with Mozart, she's very elaborately dressed with an extremely fluffy wig. She certainly doesn't look.
What was she doing
poor.
at that party? Maybe as Mozart's guest?
I got the impression that they hadn't known each other until then.
They really implied that as well. So it is hard to fit this first scene at the party into the rest of the narrative. The conflict with his dad is another big theme that runs throughout the movie. It kind of implies that Don Giovanni, that the evil spirit from the end of Don Giovanni is his dad.
Yeah, which really bothers me. This is a common
that.
Misconception of Don Giovanni. So if you aren't familiar with the end of that opera, the second to last scene, a lot of people think it's the last scene, but it's not. In the second to last scene, Don Giovanni, who is a rake and a cad and has sexually assaulted numerous women throughout the show, finally has to reckon with the evils that he has done. And there's this statue that comes to life to condemn him, or to give him one last chance of redemption, which Don Giovanni refuses, and then he is sent to hell. A lot of people, possibly because they've seen this film or the Peter Shaffer play, I can't remember how they address this in the play, think that Il Commendatore, that statue character, is Don Giovanni's father. In Amadeus, Salieri watches that scene and thinks that it is Mozart sort of being afraid of being condemned by his father. Il Commendatore is not Don Giovanni's father. He is the father of Donna Anna, who Don Giovanni is attempting to rape in the first scene of the opera. And the father comes in to try to defend his daughter, and Don Giovanni kills him. It's not really a paternal relationship that scene is exploring.
And you're right, it implies that because it superimposes Mozart's dad's face directly faded on top of the evil spirit's face.
And
so
also,
it's very implied.
I don't think it's the first time we see Leopold, but when Leopold comes to Vienna, when we get this extended sequence about Mozart's relationship with his father, Leopold is backlit at the top of some stairs, and he stretches out his arms to hug his son, but is raising his black cloak as he does so, creating this sort of specter-like...
The exact famous pose from the opera.
While the first two notes of the Don Giovanni score are played, the first two chords.
Having now seen a few Mozart operas, what really strikes me is how political they are. I mean, Mozart is not... casual about having anti-nobility themes be core to a lot of his work. And Don Giovanni he's getting in trouble for being an evil nobleman, not for liking to party too much. And so, in the real opera, it's not Mozart's dad. It's the spirit of the vengeful public. I also wanted to give a special shout out to Cynthia Nixon, who plays a pretty small role in the movie, but does a great job.
This might be her first theatrical major film appearance.
I think you might
she
actually
looks like
be
a teenager.
Right. I believe you're right that this is one of her very first major appearances.
One thing that I didn't understand with what they did with Cynthia Nixon's character, maybe you can illuminate it, or maybe it's just bad. She seems to not like Mozart. So Salieri, the Mozart family can't afford a maid, and their house is pretty sloppy. Salieri hires this young girl to go work as their maid, and he says, to say like a patron is providing this free of expense for you guys, so that she can spy on Mozart's work and report back to Salieri. As Mozart becomes more sick and more dissolute and more obsessed with the Requiem and the magic flute, he starts like yelling and getting violent, and she is afraid of him, and there's a scene where she goes to Salieri and says, "I'm not going back, he frightens me." Then when Mozart dies, we have the procession of people following the coach with his coffin, which is notably small. It's his wife, his mother-in-law, Salieri, Madame Cavalieri, she's back, and Cynthia Nixon's character, this maid, who is having the most emotional reaction to the death. There's a weirdly long shot of her absolutely bawling watching this body be carried away. And I'm like, one, why is she here? Two, she didn't like him. Why is she so sad that he's dead?
She does make a big deal, you're right, as the story progressed, about how scared she is to be there. But I don't think we're supposed to be like she's scared because she hates Mozart or think that he's even necessarily a really dark figure. I think it's basically implied that she can see that he is devolving and that his death is approaching, and is terrified because she doesn't know what to do about it, and in a way sort of feels responsible for it because she knows that it's part of her secret intrigues that are bringing all this stress into his life.
One thing, I don't know if they got an Oscar for this, but I really want to shout out the makeup job that is being done on Tom Hulce.
Dick Smith and Paul LeBlanc won the Oscar.
Makes sense, because he really looks sick in the last couple of scenes. He looks extremely rough.
He looks like someone that's dying from drug abuse and neglect. Yeah. He really does look like it.
Yeah, so I do want to talk about, like, Salieri accuses himself of killing Mozart. Did he kill Mozart? He, as this masked Requiem commissioner, he's also giving Mozart money.
You're right.
So, and it seems like Mozart might have just died of poverty, like died of starvation, if he hadn't gotten that.
I mean, the point is supposed to be that Mozart should have been working on other things, like maybe just doing these fine operas, and that would have led to a more stable lifestyle. And Salieri is constantly convincing him not to take any of these reasonable choices and instead pursue this obsession with the one piece, thinking that there's going to be such a huge payday at the end that maybe will never materialize.
The impression I get is that Salieri may have hastened Mozart's death.
Yes.
But he wasn't going to live much more than a year anyway.
I don't know.
Because he was, Mozart is making all these bad decisions even before the Requiem Mass gets commissioned, and even before his father's death. And also, the real-life Mozart was not being blackmailed by a mass Salieri, and he did still die at 35.
He certainly didn't mean for him to die at that moment with this Requiem Mass and that he needs
unfinished,
and in a way where his wife is right there in the room. Salieri's whole plan is to take credit for Mozart's Requiem Mass, which is one of his most famous and acclaimed works.
And it is unfinished in real life.
It is unfinished. He did die writing it. He was planning on presenting this as a piece of music that he wrote at Mozart's funeral. And so that's his whole scheme. And that scheme actually doesn't happen at all. So if it's a murder, then God has yet again thwarted one of his ambitions.
Yeah, and Salieri does say, when he is talking to the priest in 1823, he says, I had this plan to get him to write the death mass, and then I would present it as mine at Mozart's funeral. But I wasn't really sure how to kill Mozart. That kind of gave me some pause. So it seems like maybe if he had just been able to get Mozart to finish the Mass, everything would have worked out perfectly, even more perfectly than Salieri had intended.
Yes.
Because Salieri's initial plan was presumably get him to finish the Mass and then, like, strangle him or something like that.
Who knows? But
it seemed like Salieri hadn't come up with a real way to kill Mozart, because even that was a step too far. That did seem too horrifying for him. I think Salieri thinks that God is the one who killed Mozart, but God only killed Mozart because God didn't want Salieri to have any fame or success.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the cinematography and the way the story is told does really imply that Salieri is responsible. But I see that the facts don't entirely line up that way.
Well,
so
Salieri tells the priest, like, God, called his beloved to him. Amadeus, by the way, means beloved of God.
Yes.
Salieri says God called his beloved to him rather than let a mediocrity share in a piece of his fame.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Okay, so we've been recording for almost 90 minutes.
We're going to take a break now.
We're going to take a pause. This episode is going to be so long. And then we're going to come back to talk about The Prestige. Okay, this is your final warning. Spoilers for The Prestige are going to begin immediately, including in the cast list. The Prestige is a 2006 science fiction film directed by Christopher Nolan, written by Christopher Nolan, Jonathan Nolan, who is his brother.
It is his brother.
And Christopher Priest. 2 Nolans, 2 Christophers, 3 men. And it stars Christian Bale as Alfred Borden, Hugh Jackman as Robert Angier and Gerald Root, Michael Caine as Cutter, Scarlett Johansson as Olivia Wenscombe, and Rebecca Hall as Sarah. And they are not main characters, but I do want to shout out to particularly famous featured actors. David Bowie plays Nikola Tesla, and Andy Serkis is Ali, Tesla's assistant.
Definite highlights of the movie, from my opinion. Yeah, so Christopher Priest wrote the book, I believe in the late 80s, if I remember correctly, was pretty successful and pretty early on had optioned it for a movie deal and got the ability, a pretty rare ability for any author, to choose his director. And he chose Christopher Nolan. He enjoyed some of his earlier works like Memento, or he didn't enjoy Memento, but he thought it was impressive. He liked Following, which was Christopher Nolan's first major movie. Christopher Nolan got attached to the project in 2000, brought in his brother, who they've worked together on several different films, worked on the script for several years. He worked with Christian Bale for, of course, the Batman. He did Batman Begins with Christian Bale. And then after that, shooting began on The Prestige in January of 2006. Shooting ended in April of 2006. They shot in Los Angeles and some scenes in Colorado. And
it's hard to fake those mountains.
I could be wrong. I believe that Tesla's laboratory is in California, but the hotel that Robert Angier stays at is in California or Colorado, and that is something of a real hotel.
Okay.
Shooting ended in September of 2006, and the movie was released in October of 2006.
It's a little break from Batman, isn't it? I believe Batman Begins is 2005. Then Christopher and Christian squeezed this one in before doing The Dark Knight.
So The Prestige came out in October of 2006, basically at the same time as another big movie about magicians that came out called The Illusionist. Also a pretty good movie, very different in tone. And it was a fairly successful movie when it came out. It opened number 1, made $15 million in its opening weekend. It made $53 million domestically and $110 million around the world, so definitely financially successful. It wasn't the hit with critics when it came out that it is now. It had a 76% on Rotten Tomatoes.
When it came out?
When it came out. A lot of reviews were positive. Some were pretty negative and just said it's too confusing, it's too weird, I don't really care about this rivalry. Didn't really do great for the awards. Was nominated for 2 Academy Awards for cinematography and for art direction. Nothing for directing, acting, or for writing. Totally ignored by the BAFTAs, despite having several people from the United Kingdom that are involved in its production, including Christopher Nolan. Was nominated for a Hugo Award, so had some presence in the sci-fi community, but was actually pretty under the radar. Of course, now it's developed a lot more of a cult following.
So after we finished watching this, we were talking about how different The Prestige is every time you watch it. For me, this was my third time, and you said this was like your 9th or 10th?
It's more than that.
Okay.
I think The Prestige is the best movie to rewatch of any movie in the world. Mm-hmm. Every time I've seen it, I've enjoyed it more.
Interesting. I feel like I've had a different experience every time I've watched it. And for a movie with, that's deliberately concealing information that then makes your second viewing really different, it's common to have a really different first and second viewing experience. But I find that I'm also having a really different third viewing experience. So the first time I watched it, I was just like, what's going on? There's so much stuff. I'm confused. Second time I watched it, I felt sort of conspiratorial with it. Like, aha, I know the secret. I'm able to, I get all these references that they're making earlier in the show. The third time, I was kind of like, I think this movie might be dumb. Because I just felt like once you know the secret, and then once you've gotten to feel special because you're in on the secret, I just felt like they were so obviously telling you what the ending is throughout the first quarter or first third.
Yeah.
To the point where it's maybe awkward and works less well in the moment. So here's the specific thing I'm thinking of. And this is there's lots of twists in The Prestige. This is the biggest. Alfred Borden is in fact twins. There are 2 of him and they are sharing one life. So early in the show, early in the film, Alfred Borden is working as an assistant to another magician who has a trick that involves looking like he's killing a dove, like he's crushing it in a cage. And then it turns out, the dove's really alive. And there's a little boy in the audience for this show. He starts crying when he sees the dove get crushed. And then is not consoled even when you have The Prestige, where we see that the dove is still alive. Alfred Borden walks up with the dove and says, hey, look, he's okay. And the little boy says, what about his brother?
Yes. Foreshadowing much,
Christopher.
Yes.
And that's honestly a kind of awkward line to say. And it seems maybe a little unbelievable that this 8-year-old kid would be incredulous of a magic trick when all of the adults believe it.
Yeah, so I think this sequence, I find it pretty believable and compelling. I'm not sure I agree, but I know what you mean. It is a bit more abstract, I guess, than the rest of the piece. I believe this is inspired by some events from the book. Okay. So, of course, it is based on the book. I've read the book. It's a very good book. Very, very different from the movie. And in the book, part of the story is telling the origin of Alfred Borden and sort of how he came to be so interested in magic. And we see him as this sort of child character that goes to magic shows and can see through the tricks and sees the darker truth behind them. So I think that's where it's pulling that from. And, for good or for bad, the movie does very intentionally hammer home this bird trick as the theme of the movie. That the way you do a magic trick is that you tell people one thing and you give them kind of a nice explanation that they believe in is kind of magical, but there's actually a darker, more real explanation. And it's sort of, I guess, a metaphor for the creative process. And people don't know how much you have to sacrifice to be a great creative. I don't know, like a movie director, like Christopher Nolan or whatever.
I'm so tortured, guys.
Yes. It's definitely pushing that point hard. I think, and I may have had this happen to me, I think if somebody was watching this movie and in the first 20 minutes, they said, I think he's a twin, that would be an explanation. Mm-hmm. I would not find that all surprising. I don't feel like that's that hard of an explanation to guess. Mm-hmm. It's definitely hinted at if you're looking for it throughout the film. And it's not actually that hard to believe. It's like, there could be twins. Twins are a thing. Once you just remind somebody that twins exist, then it's sort of the obvious explanation. Yeah. And it doesn't really make sense that Angier can't even process that idea. They do set up a guard for it where during the course of Angier actually ends up shooting Robert Borden and blowing off a couple of his fingers. And so then the sort of excuse for why they can't be twins is that the performer always is missing these fingers. Now, we are eventually revealed somewhat gruesomely that his twin then cut off his fingers to match it. And that's, again, going with the idea that well, that's just too gruesome of an idea to imagine. So the human brain won't allow that idea to interrupt and disrupt its internal paradise.
Oh, I didn't think it was the mind was rejecting it because it was too gruesome. I don't think that's incorrect, but the main thing I was getting from it was Angier cannot fathom someone being that devoted to their craft.
Yes.
Which is why I picked the series title I picked.
Yes, I agree with you. Somewhere inside that space. Either that would require too much commitment from the performer, or that it's just too dark and they don't want to think about it. And so, yes, that point is hammered home. And for something that's supposed to be a secret, to have it hammered at you throughout the whole movie, I could see that maybe cutting against the natural rhythm. You know, a lot of people going to see this movie, when in the theaters when it's first released, have read the book. And so in the book, the Alfred Borden being a twin is revealed more or less very early on in the book.
Interesting.
They don't actually say that, but the book is entirely a diary. Is that still epistolary if it's all a diary, or does it have a different name? Well, whatever.
I don't think it's epistolary.
It's told all in journals. And the journal, Borden's journal, is not really a journal. It's a device for the two twins to communicate with each other. This is how they collaborate on things, by writing to each other through the journal. And so there's several points where he talks about, I am mad that I did that, and I would never do that, and that's not a believable thing for I to do. And sometimes it even says, like, I went to this place. So you're supposed to pick up on it pretty quick that, oh, I get it, there are two people. And didn't he maybe say something about having a brother at some point at the beginning of the book or something like that? So you know from the kind of the beginning that they are twins. Also And
for people who are pursuing this podcast even without having seen the film, the reason that this twin situation is so remarkable is that it enables Borden to do this seemingly impossible trick, which he calls the transported man, which involves closing himself into one box and appearing instantaneously in another box, 10 feet away on the stage.
And it's actually a pretty interesting idea, because it is a very simple idea that's basically impossible to do as a magic trick.
Yes.
So it's a great, the book has much bigger focus on the artistry of magic and the technology of stage magicians and how all that worked in the 19th century. And it's much more technical in that way. And that's something that is discussed some in the movie, but is not really the focus. Also in the book, the secret of Angier's trick is revealed to the audience pretty quickly. And that situation gets out of control real fast. Maybe you could explain what's going on with Angier in the plot.
Well, it is arguably also revealed very early in the film. It's in that opening sequence. We do see Angier's body drowning.
That's true. We do see him drowning. At that time, we're led to believe that there is no other Angier when we see him drowning at that time.
Do you want me to explain Angier's
Why don't you?
The real transported man?
Yes, the real transported man.
So this is where the science fiction comes in. It seems like a purely historical piece for the first at least half, maybe even more. Angier works with Nikola Tesla to build this machine that uses science and alternating current to effectively create a clone. And it creates a clone some distance away. It seems to work somewhat inconsistently, but somewhere between 15 and 100 feet away, it creates a clone of whatever is standing in the machine. And the trick that the real transported man trick, what Angier is calling his trick, involves creating a clone. So the guy standing in the machine falls through a trapdoor, and you can kind of see him fall through the trapdoor.
Yeah, that's not really part of the trick.
They're not working super hard to conceal that he goes through a trapdoor. But the real magic is that he then appears at the back of the theater and says, "How did I get here so fast?"
Right.
No one else besides Tesla knows that this is a cloning machine, so they're just like, how did he do that? And the
audience thinks he's being transported, but he's not being transported at all. He's just being duplicated.
And the Angier that was standing in the machine goes through a trapdoor, not just to below stage, but into a water tank where he is killed. So Angier is creating clones of himself that he is killing. And I think the film wants it to be unclear which is the real Angier.
It's not unclear, though. I think the film is trying to do that, and it fails to do so.
Yeah, I think, it's pretty obvious that each clone has identical memories. They both have the experience of being Angier up to that point in time. They are equally real Angiers.
I think that's a fine explanation. I would submit that it is the drowning Angier that is, I don't know if it's the real Angier, but it is the original Angier.
Yes.
The other Angier is a clone of him. And, Angier sort of tries to tell himself that he might be either, but I think he is the one that falls into the pit and the tank and dies.
Yes.
And the other Angier is a new clone of him. But, so in the book, this all works differently.
Interesting.
So in the book, there is still the rivalry, of course, between Borden and Angier. But when Angier finds his way to do the trick, he does go to Tesla, and Tesla does build him a machine. But when the machine clones him, the clone is already dead. It clones.
Interesting.
Let me say it again. When the machine clones him, the original Angier dies as part of the process.
Okay, and he doesn't have to intentionally murder the original.
Right. A new clone is created in the other place. So he doesn't have to choose to murder it. The other one is just dead. And there's a bit where in the book where he, for sort of half the book, he just says, yes, and then I had to clean up the prestige materials. Mm-hmm. And then halfway through the book, we learn the prestige materials are his corpse, or at least his former corpse.
A corpse of him.
A corpse of him. And then the second half of the book is about when Borden comes in, and it's really not clear if it's an intentional or accidental sabotage, but turns the machine off in the middle of the transformation. Mm-hmm. And as a result, Borden is divided into two different people. One, a sort of sickly, weak-willed person that's living in the body. And then another version of Borden is created that is like a non-corporeal shadow wraith figure that is that is Angier's will personified. And
I wish you guys could see my expression right now.
It gets more science fiction and more horror-y. He basically frees his ghost from his body.
That actually sounds like fantasy to me rather than science fiction.
Somewhere in that space, yeah.
One thing that I wanted to talk about, which involves talking about the whole plot of the film, so maybe it would be good, because even if you've only seen this film once, it might be nice to have someone walk you through it again.
You kind of need it.
Because this is maybe the most plot I've seen put into 2 hours.
Yeah.
So we have 3 timelines that eventually catch up with each other. There's Alfred Borden's trial for the murder of Robert Angier. There is Angier trying to figure out how Borden was doing his transported man and going to Colorado to work with Tesla. And then there is the one that starts with the beginning when they are both stagehands, pretend they're plants for another magician who tie fake knots around a woman who is in fact Robert Angier's wife. I haven't read the book, and I wanted to know about whether an event that happens in the film also happens in the book, because I think it really changes the perspective on who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, which is maybe an overly simplistic question. So I'm not planning to have this guy's the good guy and this guy's the bad guy answer. But we can use this simplistic question to have maybe a more complicated conversation. I think what's going on in the film, and maybe I'm wrong, is that we are kind of set up to feel like Borden is the bad guy. There's several scenes that we see of him being mean to his wife, where because times he's being mean, she's not actually his wife, it's the other brother trying to pretend to be nice.
And he's like, I'm not in love with you. I don't have any sentimental feelings for you at all.
Yeah. He doesn't literally say that.
Sure.
He's trying to pretend.
Clearly gives that impression.
He's not good. He's clearly not committed enough to pretend to love this woman. I feel like the movie spends most of the time leading you in the direction of Borden is the bad guy because he's mean. But in the end, it turns out Angier is the real monster. So here's what I want to know. Here's my moral evaluation of the piece. In this sort of first sequence, where we see they are plants for a trick that involves tying up the assistant hands and feet and then dropping her into a tank, covering this tank with a curtain, and then 30 seconds later she has miraculously come out of the ropes and undone the padlock on the tank.
It's a terrible design for a magic trick.
And
that's not the
herself.
point, but it really doesn't make a lot of sense.
Victorians were morbid and also bored. So we see this trick happen the first time, and then we see backstage Julia, who is the lovely assistant and also Angier's wife, is agreeing with Borden that they should do a different knot. So Borden thinks there is a knot that will be easier for her to get out of. But Cutter, played by Michael Caine, who is the engineer, the designer of the tricks, says that it's not a water-safe knot. So even if it's easier to untie, because she's going in the water, that's going to tighten it and she won't be able to get out. Then we see them perform the trick again. We see a look between Borden and Julia as he's tying this knot around her hands, where she seems to be saying, yes, let's do what we planned.
That's implied.
This turns out to be the wrong choice because she can't get her hands out of the rope and she drowns.
Way too fast for a real person to drown, but that happens several times in the movie.
I would say the biggest problem with this film is that it depends on people drowning way faster than people would actually drown.
Yeah.
So Angier remembers this conversation that Borden had been having about trying a different knot, and he thinks he can't get a straight answer from Borden about which knot he tied because he's asking a different Borden than the one who actually tied the knot.
He doesn't know. He wasn't there.
So Angier develops this obsessive hatred for Borden because he thinks Borden killed his wife. So then it starts out as a sort of magical rivalry where he's trying to top Borden's act. But then once he works with Tesla, he develops this plan to frame Borden for his murder. So the plan is he is going to do this magic trick, which is horrifying to him personally, because he either has to kill himself or kill his clone. But
it's definitely killing yourself.
It is killing himself.
Sorry.
So he has to drown himself every time. So he's doing, a limited engagement of 100 performances. This is, I believe, the only trick in the show. Or maybe there's another trick.
No, there's more. It's the finale.
Okay. To tempt Borden to come try to figure out how he's doing it. Borden can't figure it out because it's a magic machine. And in one performance, pushes his way backstage, gets underneath the stage, sees the tank, which is being manned by a blind man. So Angier doesn't want anyone to know that he's making clones and killing himself. So he sees Angier fall into the tank and, interestingly, tries to save him. Like Borden, even though even though Angier has cut off his fingers, he still wants to save Angier.
Yes.
Angier knows that Borden didn't kill him, but is attempting to kill Borden in revenge for his wife by framing Borden for his murder. And that's basically the whole reason he's doing this trick.
That's right.
It's to get back at Borden and also obtain custody of Borden's daughter, because he feels like Borden got to have this great family life that he was deprived of by Borden deliberately, or at least plausibly, killing his wife with the wrong knot.
Negligently.
Yeah.
I think you're trying to ask me, in the book, does the wife die by Borden's negligence? Yeah,
so what I want to know is, in the book, do they convey the information, and if so, how did they convey the information that Mrs. Angier signals to Borden that they should try the new knot, and thus this is a tragic accident and not what Angier thinks, which is him deliberately killing his wife?
So the answer is, in the book, this whole situation is totally different.
Okay.
So there's not going to be the answer that you're looking for, unfortunately. They don't work together. His wife doesn't die. Their rivalry starts because Borden reveals that Angier is doing spiritualist seances and tricking people. And in one of these events, he accidentally knocks down someone that he thinks is just an assistant. Turns out that it is secretly Angier's wife, and she has a miscarriage as a result. So there is something like that happens, but Borden actually never finds out that this happens. Okay. This is something that we only find out from reading Angier's journal. So Borden has no idea really why Angier is mad at him other than professional jealousy.
Okay. So I think once we get the full picture of the film, I think we're supposed to be like, oh, I was led to think Borden is the bad guy just because he's gruffer and meaner. But really, Angier is the one with this, overly obsessive desire to destroy Borden's life that he was willing to go to such graphic lengths to achieve. And one thing that I would have loved to have been cut from the screenplay is after one of the Bordens, the one who is not actually the father of Jess and the husband of Sarah, is executed, the other Borden, who they don't know is still alive, shows up to take his daughter back and to shoot Angier.
Right.
When Angier is shot, they have a little tete-a-tete.
Famously whispered and hard to understand. And for many people ruins the movie.
Did we put subtitles on?
We put subtitles on very intentionally.
One of the things that Angier says is something along the lines of, "You never understood why we did it. we do the magic so that people can like dream beyond the limits of their imagination to show them that all of this stuff is possible. And I was like, what?
I don't remember that part of the scene.
You erased it because it's bad.
Yeah.
It's just one sentence. They don't really exchange
that
about
doesn't
it.
belong in that scene at all.
Borden doesn't engage with this.
Yeah.
But I think it was trying to redeem Angier and make him seem like, a visionary who wants to inspire the masses, when that has not been established anywhere earlier in the film. And I think it was maybe to make Angier more sympathetic. When really, I think he could have just gone with, he's the bad guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Christopher Nolan doesn't see Angier as the bad guy. And I think Christopher Nolan feels that his quest for vengeance is partially justified. Borden killed his wife, more or less, and he wants vengeance, and don't kill my wife. So that's the story there. And maybe he's too obsessive about it, but that's supposed to be mainly bad for himself. And he would be happier if he would just let it go for a wide variety of reasons. And maybe he's sort of taking it too far, and you can not like him for that. But I think he sees him as someone who has a fundamentally righteous quest for vengeance. Okay,
well then I think he messed up by including the scene where Borden tries to save Angier when he sees he's drowning.
It doesn't necessarily mean that Angier is right.
Do you mean accurate about the death of his wife or morally righteous?
No, I mean, it's maybe Borden is a good guy, and it would be more appropriate for Angier to see Borden as complex. I mean, it's complicated because he's two people.
Yeah.
I do think that Angier would be surprised that he was really trying to save him, and that is meant to cut against what Angier thinks. But Angier thinks that Borden is a monster and his vengeance is just. It's a difficult movie to discuss at all without spoilers, like you said, because there is so much question of all the identity.
Yeah.
For example...
this is something I wanted to bring up.
Oh, yeah.
So I definitely liked it less this third time. I think this might still be a great movie, but also I kind of hate it. Because I feel like I'm not allowed to have criticisms of it. Because there's so many twists and late game reveals. A lot of times I'll have a complaint about something and then it's eventually revealed. I'll have a complaint about, like, that's not how the Victorian society would actually work. Or how does this person know this thing? Or something like that. A problem with the script and the plotting. But then it will eventually be revealed that, like, aha, this actually made sense the whole time.
Sure.
I think that there are some things there are actually problems with the script, but so much happens that I can't keep track of everything after the film. And during the film, I can't possibly know if something is later going to be revealed to actually make sense.
Yeah, I think this film reminds me of another convoluted magic box story, Primer, another sci-fi story, this one more about time travel, and that the actual plot is so complicated and really does require one of those fancy infographics to follow that you have to study the film because you can easily come up with a criticism that it says, oh, no, this is actually the explanation. There are a lot of things that appear to not make sense that do make sense. I think I agree with you. There are some things that just don't make sense at all. For example, there's the sequence where Angier gets his hand on Borden's diary by kidnapping who he thinks is his manager, but is actually his twin, and sort of threatening his life unless Angier hands over the diary. And then later...
Angier has the diary.
You're right.
He's asking for the word that will decode the cipher that the diary is written in.
Correct. Thank you. And so he sort of walks away, happy that he has this cipher. And then he eventually goes through and reads the diary and discovers that it doesn't actually reveal everything that he wanted it to reveal. And Borden...
The whole diary was a plant.
Was a plant, and he's tricking him, and Borden wrote a sort of mocking message for him at the end of the diary. At a situation like this, it would be entirely possible that when they met to do this handoff, that Angier would have engineered it in some way where he gave him the code word. Angier went and sat and read the diary for a few hours using the code word, and only at the end of that would hand back this person that he had kidnapped. That would be a perfectly plausible thing for him to do. So Borden's strategy of double, triple tricking of him could have absolutely backfired. And he's just sort of totally lucky that it doesn't go that way. There's tons of things like that.
Here's the one I had a problem with, and maybe you can explain this because you've seen it more than me. Borden is at any given time either pretending to be Borden or Fallon, Borden's engineer, by putting on a bunch of wigs and some jowly prosthetics. Small complaint, which I don't think Nolan can confuse us out of, is that I think this film depends on wig technology being way more advanced than it actually was in the 1890s.
It kind of implies, I think the movie is best categorized as a steampunk movie.
Okay.
And so we have to just accept that there are a lot of things. For example, some of the contraptions that they use in their magic tricks, like these rapidly unfolding cages, the technology is not possible to do this in the 19th century as well.
Okay.
So we have to categorize it as a steampunk movie and just accept that they have, secretly, magicians have really good wigs, if you know the right people. So, yeah.
So I'll set that one aside. But I didn't understand why the Borden who isn't married to Sarah is spending so much time around Sarah. He doesn't like her that much. And it seems like, why can't he just be Fallon whenever he's around Sarah? I mean, it makes sense that, like, occasionally, because they can't do the change quick enough or whatever, he has to be there as Borden. But it seems like they're kind of spending equal time as Borden and thus having to spend equal amounts of time with Sarah.
Yeah. So there's I agree that that's not really explained. I think there are some possible explanations, and again, it kind of depends on how you interpret the book as backstory or how authoritative you make it. It seems clear that both of the Bordens want to take turns being on stage and getting the applause as the magician. This is what they live their whole life for. So no matter what, no one's going to be willing to give up their turn if that means that they can't go to actually do the stage performance when it's their turn. Also, they're really, really careful about when and how they do the switch. Because several things in the movie only make sense if we understand that these two magicians are constantly watching and surveilling each other. For example, how does...
Angier and Borden.
Yeah, Angier and Borden. How does Angier know that Borden is going to come and sneak backstage during his magic trick that night, as opposed to any other night? And the answer kind of has to be... And we see some of this surveillance happening.
I think it doesn't matter what night Borden comes back during. I think it's the same result for Angier.
It maybe so. I guess it would depend on exactly how he plans on Borden being discovered being there, but maybe. And we do see them surveilling each other and tracking each other around the city. So we're supposed to believe that's just going on all the time. So it's something about how they won't do the switch unless they know that it's very safe to do the switch. And if that means that they have to just live in each other's lives, that's part of the sacrifice that they've committed to go through. I kind of agree with you that it doesn't actually seem that practically necessary, but we're supposed to interpret it as they're just really pragmatic. And if this is what it takes to keep the illusion up, that's what they're going to do.
Okay.
You look unsatisfied.
I'm not buying it.
I hear
you just don't hang out at home. Just go somewhere else.
I mean, obviously we're supposed to be setting up the theme of, like, an artist is really two people. One person that he is with his family and the tortured person that escapes during his work. Mm-hmm. So they want there to be a conflict between the artist, his wife, and his work. And the twin theme is really just a way to bring that to the story in a more concrete way. Mm-hmm. But I kind of see your point, and I do think that's handled not elegantly. I have so many questions about the movie, which is funny because I've seen it, like I said, probably 15 times now. And so there's all sorts of things that I'm still not totally sure about. Mm-hmm. So just to run down a few of those.
Okay, let's see if I can figure it out.
So I think I'm more confident now, this viewing, I'm pretty confident that Freddie, the sort of gruffer Borden who is in love with Olivia Winscombe, not with the wife, Jess, is
Sarah.
the one...
Jess is the daughter.
Sorry, Sarah. Is the one that is imprisoned. And it's Alfred, the nice, more sentimental Borden, who is not in prison. Your thoughts?
So here's a memory that I had from the first 2 times I watched this that I didn't see play out this time. And maybe it's because I missed it, or maybe it's because I made it up. I thought that the father Borden, that Jess's father, does get imprisoned. Okay. And somehow the not father sacrifices himself so that his niece can have a father, and switches while they're in prison or at some point during the trial. Now, we don't see Borden all the time during the trial. There's only a few very brief trial scenes. So I think it's entirely possible that the switch happened there. But there is, at some point, Borden does see his daughter. She comes to visit him in prison.
That's right.
And he's very loving.
He is very loving.
And it seems like that really is the father.
We're definitely led to have that impression at the time. I feel like everything else other than that one scene points the opposite way.
Yeah, so I thought that at some point there's a switch. And there is a lot of confusing stuff going on. Fallon, who is actually Borden, does come to see Borden at some point in prison. And so I thought I remembered at some point they are able to execute a switch and get the Father Borden out of jail.
Well, I think that links really well to my next question, which is, we're given the impression that Borden is so good at stage magic that he can effectively create any magic trick-like thing at any time. Mm-hmm. There's a sequence where he is in prison, sort of shackled to a table, and then with the sleight of hand, shackles a prison guard to the table and is able to sort of walk away freely as a joke. So, could Borden, whichever Borden it is, have just escaped from the prison? Is he choosing to stay in prison to, like, get the heat off of the fake Borden? But couldn't they just both live as fake identities? Apparently they're so good with these wigs and stuff. Can he just escape from prison? And is he choosing not to?
I don't know.
Okay, all right, good. Well, I haven't figured that one out either. Does Angier choose to die by drowning because he believes that what Cutter told him at the beginning of the movie, when Cutter lies to him and tells him that his wife's drowning probably wasn't very painful because drowning isn't a very painful way to die? Does he believe Cutter and is choosing that way to die because he wants that sort of same relief? Or is he intentionally choosing a way to die that's really painful as a way to, like, punish himself for his sins?
Okay, I have two thoughts on this. No idea if either of them is true. One, after we see the sequence of the wife drowning, we see a shot of Angier submerging his face in his sink, which he's filled with water, to experience the sensation of drowning. And he, pulls himself out. And it seems like he's maybe trying to be close to her through this shared experience. So he may be doing this as an opportunity to bond with his wife. That's a little bit esoteric, a little bit more concrete.
Okay.
Many of your questions may be answered by keeping this in mind, because this is very key. Okay. Angier does the real transported man to get Borden accused of murder.
That's right.
That's the whole purpose of it.
That's the whole purpose.
I think he might be doing it, he knows he has to kill this clone instantaneously somehow.
Sure.
And he chooses to do it in a way, this is practically pretty easy. Like, you can't just have someone stand there to shoot the clone, because then they would know it's a clone.
All right.
So this is a way that you can kill someone without being there and without having anyone else directly involved. But I think he wants Borden to see someone drowning to taunt him for the way that Julia died.
I think that's the answer.
Yeah.
It's not about whether his opinion about the drowning process.
Yeah.
It's to taunt Borden. Okay, I think that makes sense. Yeah, that part never quite clicks with me. They make a big point out he uses blind helpers so they don't see the dead bodies in the tanks. But then we see that there's one of these blind assistants sitting right by the tank when he drops in. And you definitely hear someone thrashing around and pounding on the walls. We established that in other of these drowning scenes.
Maybe he's also deaf. We don't hear him say anything.
That's a great point. That guy, some of the other ones talk, but that guy never does.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks. That's one more layer of this onion. And then for viewing 16, I'll have that much more to appreciate.
Okay. A couple smaller things that I wanted to complain about, even though I do think this movie is overall very good. I don't think the costumes are very good. First of all, the ladies have their hair down far too much. Ladies would have their hair up, not just for propriety's sake, but because it's gross. It's for cleanliness. Yeah. You have to take much less care of your hair. You're living
a sweaty and a dirty life. That's just
there's smog in the cities.
Yeah.
Anyway, and some of the men's clothes, when I was looking at it, not the nice suits, but they're more workaday clothes when they're earlier in their careers and not as rich. I was just looking at it and I was like, did you get that at Old Navy? Some of it doesn't look very good, and it doesn't look very nice, and not in they're gruffy commoners sort of way, but in that looks not Victorian. And I just feel like we couldn't get Christopher Nolan another $10,000 for costumes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there are several aspects of the movie that give me the impression, and it kind of makes sense from the timeline, of a rushed production.
Okay.
Because Christopher Nolan is really busy at this time. He's really kind of supposed to be doing the Batman movies, which are like really expensive, and they promised him he was going to make him a lot of money and everything. And this is like, he gets to take a break from the Batman movies to do this movie. So I think there are a lot of things about it where we can kind of see, I don't think it's budget, I think it's time.
Okay.
And there's just not the same pre-production effort that you would normally get from a traditional costume drama.
Okay.
And there are several things along like that. I think you also see problems with the music of the movie. This was something that the original reviews were really negative about, and I personally agree with, that the music is functional. It does a fine job of setting the right time and moving the story.
And it shows up really bad in this series where we have Mozart as the soundtrack guy.
Mozart and Tchaikovsky versus
Tchaikovsky.
This. And it's really pretty bad music. Yeah. It doesn't sound good. You would never listen to any of this music on its own.
We couldn't even get Danny Elfman or something.
And it doesn't really make the story more interesting at all. It's for a movie that is so interesting and so creative, the music. And in the credits, we play a Tom York sort of light pop rock song, which is a fine song, I guess.
But pretty inappropriate.
But doesn't have anything to do with the movie. And for it to start playing seconds after the final shot really distracts from the ending. So I think some of the edges of the production are very weak in a way that we don't normally see from Christopher Nolan, and that's a time pressure thing.
So the time pressure may explain the other sort of very obvious problem, which is that accents. And I think some of this might have to do with miscasting. Now, some of it seems to be that Michael Caine and Christian Bale, we knew were free because the other big project they were doing was Batman.
Yes.
And if Chris is taking time off from Batman, that means they're also free.
This is vacation for them.
Yeah.
They're not doing accent training.
So Michael Caine is using his normal accent, but we have the Australian Hugh Jackman trying and only partially succeeding to do an American accent.
That is an intentional part of the story.
Because he's British?
He's not actually American. Robert Angier is an American identity
but
that the real British Lord Codlow is taking on.
But the mistakes he's making are Australian mistakes, not British mistakes.
Well, let's bring in the wire cutter guy.
We got a Welshman to do a Cockney accent.
Yeah, that was tough.
We got the American Scarlett Johansson, who was completely incapable of doing a British accent.
It's bad.
Or even really acting the part.
Yeah, I agree.
Rebecca Hall is a Brit doing a British accent. Well
done,
done,
a great
Rebecca.
job. One of the most naturalistic performances in the whole piece comes from Rebecca.
Yes, because she's not trying to fake an accent.
Yes, everyone else is, I agree with you, struggling, and I think largely with the accent.
Yeah.
I think that is a big problem. Partially, these are the people they have. Partially that they're directing the film at an American audience and expecting them just not to have any sophistication about what's an appropriate accent there. I think there's another fact to it. But again, I think the answer is we need another month of rehearsal, of accent training, stuff like that. And you can tell these are the things that are getting skipped in this production. And it's fully edited because Christopher Nolan doesn't have to sit there in the editing room all day doing it. But the idea of, okay, let's take another month to plan the movie, that's just not going to happen here. We got to go do Batman 2, the good one. Maybe to close off, you mentioned thinking about your excellent idea for Best Cameo Oscar. I personally, though I don't know that it's truly the best performance, I have an obsession with I call him the real magic promoter, who comes in towards the end of the movie when Angier is ready to debut his real transported man.
The guy with the very unique face.
That's right. I don't think it's a scar. Maybe he just has very jowly jowls.
His face is asymmetrical. I'm
not sure.
I think I've seen him in other things.
I think you're right.
And I think that is his real face.
Okay.
His name is... That man is Edward Hibbert. I think that is his real face. It looked like it seemed like there is some scar tissue, but he had like some trauma to his jawbone. But it gives him a very like unique sort of...
He looks distinguished.
Very distinguished, and maybe... I think he might get typecast as villains a lot. He's not a villain here. No. He's just...
I think he's supposed to... The effect is supposed to make you just feel like he's super posh.
Yeah.
Which I think comes across well. So he does a good performance. He's sort of brought in to promote Angier's real transported man, and he recognizes immediately that this is not a magic trick. That Angier is doing real magic, as he sort of calls it, or we can call it science fiction or steampunk or whatever term we want to give it for this piece. He doesn't say this is steampunk now, but that's the basic idea that he's trying to bring. And so I think he does a great job, and I desperately want Christopher Nolan to launch the Real Magic Promoter Cinematic Universe, because he says, oh, this is real magic. I haven't seen that for some time. And I want to know, okay, when was the last time you saw real magic? What are these? This guy clearly is like, oh yeah, I'm the guy in London who's seen all the real magic performances. So this is another one of those. I'm like, can we do like 4 other movies about all of your other real magic performances? Those sound great. I bet they'd be great movies. So I'm not sure if he's worthy for the Oscar, but I think he is worthy for his own cinematic universe.
And finally, part 3 of the triple feature is Black Swan, which is a 2010 film directed by Darren Aronofsky, written by Mark Heyman, Andres Heinz, and John McLaughlin. It stars Natalie Portman as Nina Sayers, the Swan Queen, Mila Kunis as Lily, the Black Swan, Vincent Cassel as Thomas Leroy, the Gentleman, Winona Ryder as Beth McIntyre, the Dying Swan, and Barbara Hershey as Erica Sayers, the Queen.
So Darren Aronofsky discussed the idea of a ballet movie with Natalie Portman. They knew each other professionally all the way back in 2000, but it was just sort of an idea. That would be a cool idea for a movie. What if you were in ballet? Darren Aronofsky also purchased a script by Andre Hines, which was a story about rival off-Broadway actors, kind of an All About Eve thing, but also one of them has a double and that's spooky. So All About Eve with a doppelganger.
I think All About Eve is a little spooky.
Indeed. So not too far off. John McLaughlin rewrote the story to be about ballet in 2006, and that's when it really started to come together as a project. Darren Aronofsky, right before directing this movie, directed another movie called The Wrestler, which is a story about a professional wrestler who obsession with his craft leads to his demise, and he makes a big jump at the end that probably kills him. So he said that he kind of intended those 2 films to be a series together. Production actually started on the movie in 2009. Mila Kunis was cast at the suggestion of Natalie Portman, who thought that she would be the ideal sort of pairing with a different look, but a lot of the same qualities that Natalie was bringing. Filming started in late 2009. The film was actually shot on 16mm film, which you can kind of tell gives it a slightly muted, slightly grainy sense to it. Not quite as vibrant, and so that was done very intentionally. The character of Thomas Leroy would be an acceptable way to pronounce it.
So they never say his last name in the film, I'm pretty sure.
That's true.
The way I would pronounce that in French is Le Roi.
The Roi.
Which means the king.
Yes.
But it could also be Leroy or even Leroy if we were doing an American pronunciation.
Yeah, so that character was based on George Balanchine, who was a very famous opera director in New York.
Ballet choreographer,
in New York City, who also was sort of accused of having a very exploitative relationship with many of his dancers. The film was shot on a $13 million budget, not too much. Fun fact that Libby shared with me during the production that I didn't quite follow is that Natalie Portman actually got married to her dance partner in the film, on the set of the film during filming.
Really? I thought they were married afterwards. Okay.
I'm not sure exactly what the timing of it was. They're no longer together now. That, from what I understand, there's a whole nother sexy intrigue drama about everything that happened, and Darren Aronofsky, per some notes, is involved. But this is not a Hollywood gossip podcast. The film was released in September of 2010, and I think it's easy to underestimate just how successful this movie was. It made $1.5 million in its opening weekend. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it was showing in less than 20 or less than 50 theaters. It ended up grossing $106 million in the U.S. and $330 million worldwide.
And if this means anything to anybody, David and I wanted to see this in theaters. And I think we had to wait until my spring break and find it at a second run theater. And we are not normally people who watch movies in theaters. So this was a big social phenomenon if you've forgotten from 14 years ago. Yeah.
So $330 million on a $13 million budget. Amadeus was a pretty successful kind of an artsy movie. It made $90 million on an $18 million budget. That's 400% return. This is $330 million on a $13 million budget. That's like a 25,000% return. So this film has the 21st highest gross if you count it per theater that it was showing in for any movie in all of history. So this is like exactly what you want an indie movie to do. It sold out in almost all the theaters it was showing into. It made a ton of money. It maintained its kind of street cred as an indie movie, and it ended up, of course, doing really well with the critics. It was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, and it won for Natalie Portman. Won for Best Actress. It was also nominated for Best Director, for Best Picture, which it lost to The King's Speech by Tom Hooper. This was the King's Speech year. I think it's
the last time Tom Hooper was good.
Oh yeah, that's a discussion for another podcast. I think it's a better movie than The King's Speech. I think The King's Speech is a good movie.
I agree.
But I think it's the better movie. The King's Speech is the more marketable film. That's a discussion for another time, maybe.
You can show The King's Speech to your daughter and your grandmother.
And that's a nice thing about the movie. Stuff to do with this one. Also, it was nominated for 12 BAFTAs. Only Natalie Portman, again, won for Best Actress. And Natalie Portman... I think it's a great performance of Natalie. Regardless of my opinion, though, this is one of the most acclaimed performances in the history of cinema.
Yes.
She won every award. She got a ton of attention. If you go to find your list of great actress performances, there's a very high chance it's going to be on it. So this, Natalie Portman was already extremely successful, but this sort of moved her into all-time Hollywood royalty. It is notable how poorly this film is received inside of the ballet community.
Yeah.
It's very disliked, and I think it's a fair point that they feel like it perpetuates basically every negative stereotypes about ballet dancers and uses them as a foil and gives no sort of real respect or humanity to their craft. It doesn't, for a movie about ballet that's about all of this excellent ballet dancing, there's actually very little dancing in the movie. I think probably that's part of what makes the film successful. You don't, that could be kind of boring for many audiences, and they don't have to sit through it or even really try to appreciate ballet. You're not really expected to even know that the dancing is really supposed to be better than the other. It doesn't try to dazzle you with that. So it's not a celebration of ballet. A lot of people in the ballet community don't like it, and there are various controversies surrounding that. One thing I find really interesting about the opening of the movie is that we see Natalie dancing with this evil swan figure
Rothbart.
from the play. Rothbart, thank you. In a dream, what is implied to be a dream sequence. I sort of find it interesting that she is dancing with a male dancer as her enemy in this opening sequence. When throughout the film, there's various motifs about her real enemy being women. Either her mother, her colleague / lover, or maybe not really, or herself. I mean, she definitely has a rivalry with Vincent Cassel or Leroy's Thomas' character, but he doesn't seem to be embodied at all by this Swan character.
Yeah, I think something that confused me about Aronofsky's approach to this is based on numerous things, one of which you heard me say in the cast list, which is that the actors are all credited as playing 2 roles, one of which is their character's name, and one of which is a role from Swan Lake. It seems like Aronofsky thinks that this film follows the story of Swan Lake much closer than it actually does. This story isn't particularly... This is not a retelling of Swan Lake by any means. I think he thinks that
the characters are the same characters from Swan Lake, but he's telling a different story with the same characters, is perhaps what he might say.
Yeah.
I've not seen the traditional version of Black Swan, only various alternate adaptations of
Swan Lake.
Yes, that either. So you know more than I do.
And one complaint that I have about this is that, maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that nowhere in the film do they say the name Tchaikovsky, who is the composer, and it's his composition that really makes this ballet special, and I think that also makes the movie special. Almost all of the soundtrack is from Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. There's a couple sequences when Nina gets high in a club where they're not using Tchaikovsky's music. But the rate that we move through the movie, they are using music from an appropriate timestamp of Swan Lake. And also, the movie is about as long as it takes to perform the ballet Swan Lake. Slightly under 2 hours.
Again, we see the movie really doesn't actually have very much respect or interest in ballet, and is really only interested in it as a thematic prop.
Yeah, so when trying to think, like, is Thomas in some way Rothbart? who in the ballet Swan Lake is this evil wizard who is turning girls into swans. So the swan in Swan Lake is not a real swan. She is a girl who has been forcibly turned into a swan. I could certainly draw some parallels. They're both kind of bad guys. They seem to be sort of trapping women.
He's converting women into jaded and exploited tools for his own gain. There's some similarity there.
Yes. I can certainly point to some parallels between Thomas and Rothbart, but I don't think it's accurate to say Thomas is this movie's version of Rothbart. And I also don't think it makes sense to say Nina is this movie's version of Odette.
Mr. Aronofsky seems to strongly disagree with you on that fact.
Okay, well, maybe he should watch Swan Lake.
He's seen it a couple times, but another one might have helped. Nina's problems don't start with her work in ballet, or don't start at her job. She's already having, seems like, a really difficult relationship that she's developing with her mother,
yes,
who is controlling her. It's not established that she's pushing her into ballet, or maybe if she's insufficiently supportive, but she has a clearly unhealthy relationship both with Nina and with her work.
With her mother and with her work.
Her mother has an unhealthy relationship with Nina and Nina's work. And we are told that her mother somehow could have been a ballet dancer, maybe.
She was in the corps de ballet but got pregnant. And for the record, many women continue their ballet careers after having a child.
I think we're led to understood that she was impregnated by a ballet director, and that she was sort of pushed out in order to avoid a scandal, something along those lines. Frankly, like you, I don't know how realistic that scandal actually is. Again, this is the type of thing that the real character of George Balanchine was doing all the time and getting away with it. But that's what we're led to believe from the story. The relationship with the mom, to me, seemed to almost be a direct reference to the relationship between Maggie Gyllenhaal's character and her mother in Secretary, where we have the same thing of a overbearing mother trying to lead a sheltered daughter in a totally controlling girl-like lifestyle, and then the daughter responding with self-harm and exotic sexual experimentation. So I think that this film is intentionally trying to mirror Secretary in a lot of its tone and choreography.
Okay, I haven't seen Secretary, so I will not comment, but that sounds intelligent. And I think it's interesting to compare this to The Prestige, because in both films, there's a lot of, we don't know what's going on. And in The Prestige, it at least it attempts to answer all of those questions.
It all is supposed to make sense.
Whereas in this one, Aronofsky is quite happy to have things not make sense at the end. You can often figure out what is real and what is Nina's psychosis, but not always. And I would like to point out, I'm not sure whose perspective this film is supposed to be from, because it would make sense that this is Nina's perspective, and once she gets this role, starts having this breakdown and having these hallucinations. But even before she knows that the role of the Swan is available, even before she knows that Beth is being retired, she has this dream about it. And the scratches on her shoulder blades appear, which of course eventually turn into the wings of the Black Swan. She is already having a breakdown. Either she's already having a breakdown that is not motivated by this stress at work, or she is literally turning into a swan.
Yeah, I was struck. The first time I watched the movie, I think I came to the exact same conclusion as you. This time, on my second watching, I was struck by how much I felt like it did make sense and things were explainable. Okay. So to me, it's more clearly established that Nina is having a mental breakdown before she even finds out about the role. And maybe there's some magical realism in the idea of her connecting to the role of the swan, and that's what's motivating it. But I think fundamentally she's just in a lot of stress, trying to succeed in her job as a burgeoning ballet dancer, dealing with eating disorders and this really painful relationship with her mother, and that I think we're kind of supposed to believe that she heard something about the Swan Lake role, and that's why she's imagining it.
Yeah, well, obviously it's a very famous role, and it's very often performed.
And I think even before she finds out that she has this role or that it's available to her, she knows that it is what the company is going to be doing as their next production. So she's supposed to just sort of already be thinking about it. And I really felt like we can track everything that we see from Nina's perspective inside of her craziness. I was struck by, the first time I watched it, it's really unclear, I thought, if there's any relationship between her and Lily, Mila Kunis's character, and what's real and what's not there. But this time I walked away becoming quite confident that Lily never had any romantic connection or anything with Nina, and that was just totally imagined. That there is no physical confrontation between Nina and Lily, because every time Nina thinks that she's fighting someone else and she's stabbing somebody with a screwdriver or with a glass shard,
or being eaten out by them, one of the two,
it's always herself that's doing these things, and that there never is another person. And even these scratches at the beginning, I don't think we're at all meant to believe that this is somehow coming from a swan wing. This is just another example, and actually a pattern that's already been established according to her mother in her behavior.
So you think she just was scratching her shoulder blade with her nails,
yes,
and her psychosis later interprets this as wings growing out of her back?
I might take that a step further to say she is having this breakdown. She is imprinting herself onto the story of the Swan Lake. She knows that this lady in Swan Lake has wings, and so she is scratching her shoulders to make herself into this character.
Okay. I think watching it the second time, it became more clear that Lily is antagonistic. I think that she deliberately takes Nina out partying the day before the rehearsals are moving to on stage to make Nina oversleep, be late for the rehearsal. And so, I guess I could step in and dance it. So she is an antagonist, but just in that she's trying to take the role. And so it is really difficult for Nina, and it sort of shows how references issues of women not being believed when they make complaints, because she is having these hallucinations and this psychotic breakdown. And so when she explains it, she sounds like a crazy person. But also, Lily is actually trying to steal her role.
Yeah, the first time I watched it, I was like, okay, maybe everything that Nina sees with Lily is real, and maybe none of it is real.
I was even questioning if Lily was real at all.
I think that's fair. But this time watching it, I think there are a lot of clues that clearly imply to us that Lily is real, and at this crucial moment when they go to the nightclub together, that she is sabotaging her. She gives her MDMA, or what we're led to believe is MDMA, and Nina specifically asks, well, how long does it last? And he says a couple hours. Well, that's not true. MDMA lasts for 5 to 6 hours, and there's a very significant hangover. You're very tired for the next 36 to 48 hours. And so I think we are led to believe, just as you just said, that Lily is intentionally sabotaging her, and Nina is not crazy. And like you're saying, Nina is trapped in a world where people don't believe her because she's a pretty lady, but also people really are out to get her and sort of believe that she doesn't have anything of value, even though she has so much value. So yeah, I think that Lily is a less engaged character, and I think we actually can parse more precisely than I thought when I first watched it, which things are real and which things are not real. I think it's actually pretty clear.
Yeah. Speaking of people sabotaging Lily or sabotaging Nina, we got to talk about Thomas, the completely gross and predatory.
Yes.
I think he's the director of this ballet company, but he also does a lot of work as a répéteur, which is the person who runs a rehearsal.
Is that normally a different person?
I don't know that much about the ballet world. Normally, répéteurs are people who have been ballet dancers. I don't think we get any implication that Thomas has been a dancer. I think we only understand him as a choreographer and a sort of artistic lead for the company.
I did find it striking. There's a scene later on in the movie where he's using his position of director and using it to sort of dismiss the old lead dancer in an unceremonious and kind of humiliating way, and in order to elevate Natalie Portman. And I found myself wondering, maybe you have some insight here, do ballet directors really have that much prominence? Like, in my sense of ballet, as someone that doesn't know much about it, I have the sense of the ballet dancer is really famous. And in my mind, it'd be very difficult for a ballet director to sort of try to manipulate and upstage a dancer, because surely the dancers have so much more media capital.
Yeah.
I don't know, your thoughts.
So there's lots of different things that being the director of a production of ballet can mean. A lot of ballets have very, like, 1, 2, or 3 very famous choreographies. So for Swan Lake, it's the Petit Pas choreography, which is the original one that was performed in the 1890s. At the same time, Robert Angier was learning how to clone himself.
Quick note on The Prestige. We didn't mention that The Prestige does feature opera music, briefly, from Gilbert and Sullivan.
Oh, there is
a strain of classical music, small as it may be, that does go throughout all the pieces.
There's a real quick Mikado sting, blink and you'll miss it. If the company has decided to do the Petit Pas choreography with the conventional costumes and the conventional set, there's like a standard set and costumes that Swan Lake is frequently performed with, based on the ones from the very first production.
Okay.
If you're doing that, the director isn't really making that many choices, wouldn't get artistic prominence. What Thomas is making clear is happening in this production is this is a new staging of Swan Lake. So this is new choreography. The costumes look pretty typical, but the sets are not what you would normally see in Swan Lake. So he is sort of using the music and the story to create a new artistic vision. So I think Thomas would be a notable person in this production. You know, there would be a paragraph dedicated to him in the New York Times review of this, because he is creating a new artistic endeavor. So when you are creating a new staging of a ballet, that's sort of the same amount of prestige as directing a play, where the director is normally is making a lot of choices and is considered a key element of the artistic team.
Yeah, it's interesting that Thomas is set up as probably the most evil character in the whole story.
Yeah.
Even outside of what we do believe to be a real sabotage from Millie, and even outside of some of the weird things that people do in visions that Natalie Portman has, even none of them are really as bad as the things that we're certain that Thomas is doing in real life. I mean, he is a sexual abuser. He is a manipulator. He is ruining people's careers. I mean, he's a really, really bad person. But Nina doesn't really flee from him. I think we're partially just to see this as a story of, exploitative manipulation in show business. But it's almost like she just doesn't actually fear him that much. I remember early in the movie, there's this sequence where she's getting off the subway train or something, and she walks down the hall, and she's walking through some dark hallway, and at first she sees another figure, and she's very afraid. And then she can see that it's a female figure, and she's like, well, okay, probably not as dangerous.
That's not how I interpreted that scene, but okay.
Well, I'm interested in your thoughts. Then eventually she gets closer to this female figure and sees, oh, this female figure has my face. And then she really is scared because she has an idea what's going on. So I wonder if there's some discussion about the gender roles in that sequence, but maybe you have a different interpretation.
Yeah, I thought she wasn't initially scared because she thought it was a man. You can hear the heels clicking, and men tend to not wear high heels.
Okay, that might not trigger my thoughts.
As someone who has to pay very close attention to the gender of someone I'm passing in a dark street, I immediately clocked that as female, and I thought she was nervous. I thought she saw this woman, immediately thought, that's me, and panicked. And then sort of decides to be brave, like Thomas would want. And also, she would give herself away as a crazy person if she just started screaming in the middle of this street. Bravely gets closer to this person, and then the way the lighting works, right as they pass, she sees that this person has her face. Terrifying violin shriek, and then she turns, new shot, and sees that this person, of course, doesn't have her face. It's a different person.
Yeah.
You're crazy, Nina.
It's interesting that I saw that very differently. I'd be very interested to hear what Darren had to say about that, because it really did seem like it was a gender-focused interaction there, and that was sort of the whole point. But I really wasn't certain.
Yeah, so here's one thing I noticed about Thomas. The more Nina dedicates herself to this role of the Black Swan, Thomas is actually pleased. This does actually, he does
care about the ballet. This is not just a way to
and
get
he does
in her
respond positively to her. He tells her, she's doing a beautiful job in her final performance, which is also her first performance. And I thought that was a really interesting dynamic, because actual abusers tend to never be satisfied, and that's their dynamic. But he gets what he wants and is happy.
I agree with you, and I think it's not at all. It's certainly not effective. I don't think it's intended to excuse his behavior, but it makes an intentional choice not to just portray Thomas as a villainous manipulator. He actually is a ballet director that really does care about his art, and that's part of his story. In fact, that seems to be the main thing going on in his life and in his mind, not whatever relationship he's having with the dancers.
Yeah, so I think unusually for how the real world actually works, but maybe it makes it tie more interestingly into the other two films in this triolet, as they would say in Princess Ida.
Okay.
It's all Gilbert and Sullivan on the show now.
It happened.
Is that it seems like this is a sexual abuser who is using his position as a ballet director to have sex with women. And his goal is to have sex with women. And if running a ballet is how he does it, he's happy to do that. That's actually not what Thomas is about. I think he genuinely thinks that grabbing Nina and kissing her will make her a better dancer. I think he's maybe even not sexually attracted to Nina. I think he wants her to experience sexuality so that she'll dance his role better.
I wonder, as part of this question, is the sequence where we see Thomas and Lily having sex backstage, is that real or is that fake?
So I think that's real because that plot point ties in very closely to Swan Lake. And I think Nina is having these hallucinations about the story of the ballet. And in the ballet, the prince, the object of her desire, which is Thomas, chooses the Black Swan. And this breaks Odette.
Are you saying that makes you think it's real or it's fake? If it's part of her...
It's fake.
Oh, okay. You said... Fine.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, you do think it's fake.
She is hallucinating.
That's close enough to the story that just hits the right note for you.
Yeah. I mean, I also think it would be kind of dumb to just have sex in the middle of backstage.
It seems weird.
And also, that scene, what immediately precedes Nina watching them hook up is she is doing I think it's the coda over and over again from Odile's Act 3 variation. The pianist leaves frustratedly because he wants to go home and Nina just insists on dancing. And then all of the lights turn out. So she's alone. All of the lights turn out. So I think that's setting up this is a surreal, it's sort of horror situation.
Yeah, and everything else, there's some key that tells us with certainty, I think, if it's real or false. That's the thing that I think we do have to interpret it from the atmosphere, but that makes sense. Yeah, it's also interesting because what Nina is attracted to and what she's interested in is left somewhat open in the way the story is told. Mm-hmm. At the beginning of the story, she's, like we said, she has this dream sequence, which is sort of a dark, erotic dance with a male figure.
I'm not sure it's erotic. But
maybe it's not erotic at all. I think you actually might be right.
So that is the prologue of Swan Lake, which is sometimes included. I don't know if the original production included it or if it was added later. And I also can't remember if there is dedicated music for it or if it's just something some people do during the overture. But you do, in some productions of Swan Lake, see Odette as a girl and see Rothbart transform her into a swan.
Yeah, it's again, since so much, especially in the first half of the movie, presents this idea that the real threats to Nina is not some scary man grabbing her in the subway. It's her mother, her colleague, or herself, some very feminine figure. And I'm not sure if the film was trying to not spoil the lesbian themes that are going to come up. They
used it so heavily in marketing that I don't think that was a concern.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. So that's the part that doesn't quite fit some ways. But yeah, I mean, it turns out, I think we could reasonably conclude that Nina might be more attracted to women than men.
I mean, I think Nina is portrayed as having such an infantile sexuality that it is in some ways unformed. And whoever sexually interacts with her first is anyone sexually interacting with her, she's going to be into because she's so repressed. It can't even masturbate because mom sleeps in a chair next to her bed.
That's a big plot point of the movie.
Yeah.
So I have kind of a controversial opinion, which is that I don't think that this movie we're going to discuss it maybe in a bit when we talk about the series as a whole.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that this movie pairs best with Amadeus and Prestige.
Okay.
I think Amadeus and Prestige might be really best as their own duo. And I feel like this movie would pair really well with a movie I don't think you've seen, Birdman, the Inarito film.
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen
which
it.
I think is more similar in tone, in the story. Not has a lot of differences and kind of takes it in a different
It's about
direction.
an actor who played a superhero who is now a faded star.
That's right.
And is sort of trying to regain his light.
I think they're these are all stories about artists who struggle with obsession, but in this case, I don't actually think that Black Swan is about a rivalry between two artists. That is kind of part of the plot. That is kind of part of the story. But
that's kind of what Swan Lake is about. A rivalry between two swans for a man's love.
It's fair. I don't actually think that's what's really emphasized in this movie. Mm-hmm. Like, that's part of it, but that's almost the red herring. In fact, it's almost explicitly the red herring in the story where a lot of the artist rivalry is just not happening. There is part of it, I think, with the club drug, putting GHB in her drink or whatever. That's part of the story, and so that does do part of it. But I think it's really more about Natalie's internal conflict with her deciding what type of artist, what type of celebrity she wants to be. So, I don't know if we're allowed to do re-pairings and double pairings, but I think this would be very interesting to watch in combination with Birdman. I'd put that out.
I think the difference between this film and the other two is that Nina is clearly the main character and Lily is a side character, whereas in the other two films, Angier and Borden are both leads and Mozart and Salieri are both leads.
I agree.
And it's kind of unclear. Nina has multiple people that we could maybe slot into the rival role.
Yes.
Her mother, Beth, Lily, and Thomas.
I agree. That it has a small but very intentional visual action in that the film fades to white instead of black. Any thoughts on that from you? Either thematically as someone that has some appreciation for the original piece or just as cinematography?
Well, it fills with white light, which then resolves into a white feather with a very small black feather drooping across it as the credits play. And as the credits go on, there are more and more black feathers.
And then when Darren Aronofsky's name appears, we suddenly switch to a black background with white feathers coming down. So, I think that Darren Aronofsky is trying to say that he was the real Black Swan the whole time.
I'm a bad boy.
I'm a bad boy.
I'm a bad boy.
I think there we see somewhat of a connection to the Prestige.
Mm-hmm. Do you think Milos Forman thinks of himself as a Machiavel plotting the downfall of his enemies?
I don't think that. And I think the way that Amadeus was made, partially again because they were all somewhat unwelcome guests in a foreign country that had a repressive government, I understand there was a huge sense of camaraderie between the performers. So I don't think that was true. Although I do know that someone intentionally, F. Murray Abraham, was kept separate from the rest of the cast in order to ensure that he did not bond with people and that he did feel like they basically engineered it so that he didn't get invited to any parties. He had to stay in his own hotel. And so they tried to sort of build antipathy between him and the rest of the actors so that F. Murray Abraham would feel more isolated.
And didn't Aronofsky also do this to Mila Kunis and Natalie Portman?
Oh, yes, I remember that.
You told me the first time we watched it when it came out that Portman and Kunis spent a year learning ballet before this show went into production. And he wouldn't let them practice together.
Right.
They had their own ballet instructors and they practiced in separate rooms. And Aronofsky would sometimes show up at each other's ballet practice and say like, hey, Natalie, Mina's doing really good.
Yes. So I don't think that that's how Milos sees himself. Although, for what it's worth, I understand that Milos has maybe the worst reputation of being demanding and abrupt with his actors. He is known that if he has something negative to say, he will tell you very quickly.
So maybe he's more of a Count Orsini Rosenberg than either Mozart or a Salieri.
I think that's fair.
He would go in there and tear the ballet section out of your opera?
Yes. He would. Some of his actors, for example, they worked in television, he would tell them, television acting has ruined you. Maybe you're not ready for films anymore.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So we've kind of already started, but let's properly move into the discussion of all three of these movies. So with the triple feature, we do kind of want to save some more time. This podcast is going to be so long. To save some more time to talk about all three of them, because when we pick a triple feature, not only do we have a higher standard for those films, we think they have to all three be really excellent films, but we kind of want them to have more in common than our average pairings. So The reason I initially wanted to put these three together is that we are in an elite artistic world. These are people who are extremely committed to their craft. That's basically what the Prestige is about, how committed they are. And one of the things it's showing is how the lives of people at such an elite level of artistry is pretty unrelatable to everybody else who's leading a more well-rounded life. It also focuses on a rivalry, especially the first two. And it gets shockingly dark. Not just murderous, although they do all kind of get murderous, but like existentially, there's an attempt at existential destruction of your rival. Did you have any thoughts on pairing these or grouping these before we watched them?
Yeah, well, I do remember thinking that all of them had plots that had a sort of surface layer that was accessible and easy to follow, but then a deeper layer that actually required a lot of analysis to really appreciate. Maybe that's less true for Amadeus, although it's, again, I think hard for you and I to say because we've seen it so many times that we can easily appreciate a lot of the subtleties. So I kind of feel like, again, I'm not sure, now that I've seen it, I'm not sure that I would do it as a triple feature. I think, I'm more hesitant on that, and that's fine, it's part of the process.
Yeah, we had actually initially on the list paired Black Swan with The Red Shoes, which is also about a ballet dancer who killed herself because she dances so hard. We don't think The Red Shoes is that good of a film. It's possible that there are, in fact, more ties between Black Swan and Red Shoes. They both have colors in the name.
I think Black Swan and Red Shoes would be a better pairing, maybe.
Okay.
I think, now that I've seen it and I had to start watching it, I would say Black Swan, Birdman, two bird movies. That's really the pairing that I would go for it. So, I think that Black Swan pairs better with the Prestige than with Amadeus. Because in the Prestige and Black Swan, there's a stronger sense of these fractured identities. And that was one of the things that drew me to the series at the beginning, because Salieri does end up taking on the role of Mozart's father, which is sort of this, his patron, I forget whatever term they call him in the movie. And so there is some question about exactly who's who and who's representing what at the different times in the story. And so I think
Salieri does have this sort of two-facedness with whenever he's interacting with Mozart.
A happy face on the front and a sad face on the back.
Thank you, David. Whenever he's interacting with Mozart, he's actually, in some ways, he's being more truthful, and in some ways, he's lying more than ever, because he says, yes, I will help you get this job, and then he doesn't help you get it.
And he tells him, I love your music. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, which is true.
Yeah.
So there's this two-facedness on him telling Mozart he's going to help him, but then actually not. But then even within the face that faces Mozart, that face also has the two faces.
Yeah. So I do think that there is definitely some connecting threads that run through all three movies. I wonder if the Black Swan just pairs better with the Prestige than it does with Amadeus. I mean, they're more similar in sort of setting in the world of fine arts than they are in Black Swan and in Amadeus, but they're really dealing with such different ends of that and such different parts of that process. Nina doesn't have any creative control in her process at all. She's just executing, and she's very explicitly there to follow the whims of this director. And the other two movies are about people that have tons of creative control in their craft and have to choose not just how there's supposed to be a comparison between the compromise they're making in their lifestyle to make their art possible and the compromises they're having to make in the art itself to make it attractive to an audience. And that doesn't carry through to Black Swan.
Well, I think I definitely see these three as a progression. So we're going to preempt ourselves and talk a little bit about what order should you watch these in right now. Because I would only ever watch them in the order of Amadeus, Prestige, Black Swan.
Absolutely.
Another reason that I wanted to put them all together is that they are all set in different centuries, 18th century, 19th century, 21st century, about 100 years apart. And so it's sort of showing the universality of this story of rivalry at the absolute highest levels of artistic endeavor. And so if we drop Black Swan from this trilogy, it maybe feels like this is maybe more of a dated thing and that people don't do this anymore. But I think Black Swan reminds us that, no, people still really try to screw each other over in the artistic world today. Another reason that I would put them in this order is that, so chronologically, they occur in this order.
Yes.
They were also made in this order.
Yes.
And as we move towards the end, I sort of think of it as a cone where Amadeus is the broadest end of the cone and we narrow towards Black Swan. Black Swan is shorter, is the shortest.
The movies get progressively shorter.
They get progressively pacier.
Yes.
And they lose the sort of head of earlier artistic work that they're leaning on. So Amadeus is a film based on a play, based on another play, based on a rumor.
Yes.
The Prestige is based on a novel, and Black Swan is kind of inspired by a ballet, but I really think we should treat it as an original screenplay.
It's more a biography of George Balanchine, a particular New York City ballet director, than it is an adaptation of Black Swan.
Yeah, of Swan Lake.
Swan Lake, excuse me.
Yeah, so some things that I realized were threads between them after having watched them. First off is they all have really strong openings. We do not slowly meander our way into these films. With Amadeus, we get the 2 opening chords of Don Giovanni's overture, which we're going to hear a lot throughout this show. And then Salieri screaming, Mozart, Mozart. With the Prestige, we get these sort of sequence of shots that we can't really place while Michael Caine in voiceover explains what the Prestige is, which I think is, one, interesting and also necessary for people to not go, why is this movie called The Prestige?
Yeah, I mean, the film is set up with 3 acts that exactly follow that structure. So they're trying to do the thing where they tell you something that's actually supposed to reveal the whole plot, but you don't get it until the end.
Right. And then Black Swan opens with a ballet sequence with the camera sort of pendulum-like swinging in really close to Nina and then pulling away, slowing as it pulls away, and then it starts to move in towards her again, speeding up as it gets closer to her, and we get the sound of the whipping of wings. It's also totally wordless, and so they all have these really immediately exciting and compelling openings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all 3 films are sort of mysteries about different things.
Yeah.
In Amadeus, Salieri confesses at the beginning, and you're trying to figure out, well, wait, how did he actually do it? What are the mechanics of this crime? In Prestige, we know that there's more going on behind the scenes, and we, again, kind of know what's going to happen a little bit that's heavily foreshadowed, but we just have no idea how it's put together. In Black Swan, there is skin of mystery, but the mystery is not about how was this thing done, about which of these things are real and which of them are not.
Well, I think we could maybe phrase it so that they're even more closely tied. So at the beginning, Salieri tells us that he killed Mozart. And when we get to the end, the whole story is about, so how did he kill Mozart? At the beginning of The Prestige, we're told there's going to be a prestige. And also it's going to involve Robert Angier drowning in this vat of water. In the opening of Black Swan, we see a girl turn into a swan because of a mean wizard man. So the first 90 seconds or less tells us how the film is going to end in every case. Yeah, and in each case we're sort of left asking, well, how is that possible? That doesn't quite really make sense. And so I do think that they all give the audience an interesting mystery to play with as you watch the movie, but then are basically promising to reveal exactly how it all happens and don't actually expect you to be trying to put the pieces together on your own. Maybe less so The Prestige is a slightly more complicated case in that it's sort of requesting that you don't try to put the pieces together on your own. Another thing that I think ties all these films together is that they're all extremely not subtle. And I don't mean that as an insult. I think all of these films are great films, although at the moment I do kind of hate The Prestige. As I mentioned, in Amadeus, we're constantly getting these opening 2 chords of Don Giovanni. Like, when you hear those, pay attention. The story is happening.
Right.
In The Prestige, as I mentioned, the first maybe 30 minutes is all just really directly telling you what
They're trying
what
so
the
hard.
Answers are.
Yeah.
There's this totally unnecessary sequence where they go to see this Chinese man performing his magic tricks, and his main magic trick
that sets the theme for the whole movie. I wouldn't call that unnecessary.
It's a bit heavy-handed.
It's heavy-handed. That's very true.
His trick is that he has a goldfish bowl on a table. He puts a cloak over the goldfish bowl, and then he steps back, and the goldfish bowl is gone. He walks over to another table, puts the cloak over it, and then it is revealed that the goldfish bowl is on this other table.
Now full of water.
No, it's the same goldfish bowl with the same goldfish.
It's been full of water the whole time.
Yeah. And Borden is able to crack how he's doing it, which is he picks up the bowl between his thighs and hobbles over to set it on the other table, which requires incredible inner thigh strength.
He's been pretending that he has a disabled leg this whole time.
Right.
So he's just pretending to have a disability.
So they watch him walk out of the theater pretending to not be able to walk very well. And Borden says, this is the act. It's pretending that he can't walk well when actually he's got the strongest legs of any 80-year-old ever. Mm-hmm. And Angier is like, that's impossible.
Yeah.
I don't believe that. And Borden's like, no.
No one would ever be that committed to being a magician.
No, I think some people might be that committed to being a magician. And then I think the least subtle part of Black Swan is the color palette. Did you know that the colors that the characters are wearing can tell you about their internal lives?
Yeah.
So Mila Kunis is always in black. Natalie Portman starts in these very soft pinks, whites, and grays. Yeah. And then gradually more and more black is introduced.
Well, again, when we think about the credits, the film makes that part of the movie as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's start with all of the kind of nice people part of the production, and then we'll show the people in the background who've been planning and plotting the whole time. So it's not a subtle movie in the slightest. I had a lot of the same thoughts in Amadeus. Again, we talked about that sequence at the party where the dad's face flips around 3 times to show that Mozart can't read him. And, there's nothing about the way that it's staged that is hiding what you're supposed to be seeing. And I think in all of these movies, they are artsy movies that in their own way have succeeded with a really broad audience.
Yeah.
And so they're not asking you to do a bunch of difficult evaluation either to follow the plot or to appreciate the emotional themes. They're really given to you on a platter and you're supposed to just lap them up. And then it's supposed to be that there's just actually is enough depth and density there to appreciate the layers that are being told in the story. So, that's nice. I think it's good that you want to give people content and you don't make them work for it, but it's still worth it. That's, I think, a real success.
Yeah, subtle filmmaking is not the only valid style of filmmaking. Do you think any of these would be better or as good if they were more subtle? Or do you think the boldness with which they present their themes it helps them as necessary?
I think Black Swan is the one that, again, it's easy to underestimate how successful the film is. Mm-hmm. So Black Swan, I think of it more as an audience-friendly film than a critic-friendly film. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's definitely high-minded, and it does do some interesting things with cinematography, and it's about the fine arts. But I don't really think of it as that sophisticated of a movie, even in the way that I think the Prestige and Amadeus are very... they're big with their motions. They're easy to read. They actually are very sophisticated in their plot and how they work. I don't see Black Swan in the same way, and I think of it more as a conventional emotion-driven character story.
So here's where we're supposed to talk about, did we watch these movies in the right order?
Oh.
I think we've already answered that. Do you have anything further to say about that?
Definitely watch them in this order. It's chronological in all the ways, and I think a big factor is that Amadeus is a long movie. Even if you're watching the theatrical cut, it's well over 2 hours, and Black Swan is a pretty short movie. And I think even if you're watching this over multiple days, or if you're trying to do it all in one day, then you're going to get tired if you try to put Amadeus at the end. And I think Amadeus is, if you're coming to Amadeus with energy, it's very easy to appreciate it. Mm-hmm. Whereas Black Swan, I think, is going to do more to surprise you, to intrigue
inject
you,
energy into
to
the
tantalize you in ways. And so I think that's something that's easier to watch, even if you're not prepared to really focus on it. I think that Black Swan is in some ways the most watchable of all these movies. Amadeus and Prestige are both actually a bit dry in the fundamental stories that we're telling here, and a bit technical in what they're about. Black Swan, this is not a movie about how we can appreciate ballet and all the cool things that ballet dancers do, and actually there's more to it than you think. In fact, it's the opposite. It's like, okay, you know all those ballet cliches you're used to? Here's a fun, exciting story that involves those cliches. So it's something that's easy to appreciate with no research. On the other hand, if you like ballet and you appreciate Swan Lake, the original production, clearly there's some parallels there that you can appreciate, but that's not necessary. I almost wonder if, as you've mentioned a few times, trying to maintain and think about those parallels sometimes makes the movie actually worse.
Yeah.
And for someone who's just coming into it as like, oh, I heard Natalie Portman did a movie where she sees a doppelganger and kisses a lady, then, that's actually is what the movie about.
I do want to close by bringing it back to our series titles. Do you feel like you need to clarify My Rival, My Muse, My Killer, Myself at all? Or should we jump to mine?
That's fair. I mean, in a way, I want to not clarify it because
Perfect.
It's designed to be ambiguous so it fits the whole different things. I think it's... when I think of that title, I think the first two and the last two kind of go together. And the point is, in all these films, we have a rival that in a way is your muse. I think that's very obvious in Amadeus and Prestige. In Swan Lake, though, we do still the same thing where Mila Kunis... Thank you. Black Swan, where Mila Kunis is sort of the sexual awakening of Nina, of Natalie Portman's character, and so that sort of brings her the energy that she needs to satisfy Thomas.
Not just the sexual experience, which doesn't actually happen, but the threat of having the role taken away from her.
Yes.
Like, I think there's a meaningful chance she wouldn't have danced that hard if she wasn't at risk of losing the part. So my series title is Devotion Enough. I'm going to try to answer this question. Please add your thoughts. So, I think that the answer Amadeus has to this question is no. I think Salieri appears very devoted. He's willing to give up sex in order to create this great music, but he can't. There's nothing that Salieri wants more than to create beautiful music, and he's just not capable, and he's barely even capable of understanding. When we see him writing down the Requiem for Mozart, he keeps saying, I don't understand. And Mozart, who is not undevoted to his music, but certainly has other interests, is just somehow talented enough to be able to pull it off. So I think, is devotion enough? Milos Forman is saying, or at least in this movie, he's saying, no, you also need talent.
Fun production fact. Tom Hulse?
Hulse.
Tom Hulse. There's a little bit of controversy, but Tom Hulse said that he was frequently intentionally saying the wrong things when he was doing that final scene with Salieri in order to confuse F. Murray Abraham, so that when he would say, I don't understand, he could get some genuine, I don't understand. F. Murray Abraham says that Tom Hulse actually really was very tired and they were having trouble with the audio equipment and he just kept making mistakes and F. Murray Abraham was trying to correct him. So there's some cross-referencing there.
Interesting. I think, is devotion enough in The Prestige? The answer is more of a yes. Because Borden wins at the end. One of the Bordens dies, but there's two of them. You can't kill Borden. There's two different men. And he also gets the daughter back, which is sort of what they're fighting over at the very end. And sort of who gets to have this happy family life. And Angier is trying to steal that from him, but Borden gets to keep it. And Borden is the one who is more devoted to the craft. And any really innovation that Angier is bringing to the world of magic is based on his desire to get back at Borden.
Yeah, I think you're right that the answer there is fundamentally positive in the way that it's not in Amadeus. I would almost say the answer is something like, if you are really devoted to something, you will get it. But there's actually a lot of qualification to that because, what Angier becomes really devoted to, as he says at the end, is he wants to trap Borden. He wants to defeat Borden. He wants to get Borden. And I would say, actually, he is successful at that. He doesn't know there's two of them, but Borden, the stage musician, is dead. There will be no Borden magic anymore. So he does get what he wants. Now, what does he actually really want? He wants to be happy. He wants to get his wife back. He wants to be a better magician than Borden. He doesn't actually get those things because that's not what he really wants. It kind of makes me wonder, I think you're making a great point here, What if he had gone to Nikola Tesla and said, how can you help me bring my wife back? I mean, if Nikola Tesla is a wizard, if that's what he really wanted to, then he could have explored that option. And I think under the rules of the movie, I have every reason to think he might have succeeded. But that's not what he wanted.
Well, there is a scene where he's talking with his assistant Scarlett Johansson, where I can't remember exactly what prompts him to say this. He's looking at Borden's diary that she has brought to him. And she says something about, even if you obsess over this, why do you want this diary? Even if you obsess over it, it won't bring your wife back. And he said, I don't care about my wife. I just care about defeating Borden. Wait, I don't mean that.
Yeah, you can tell how embarrassed he is at that Freudian slip. Yeah. So yeah, you do get what you want, but what do you really want? And I think Angier doesn't actually want Borden dead. I think he does actually want his wife back, but he forgets, or possibly to be the greatest magician, but he forgets about this. I think he actually wants Borden dead. And the point is that...
I think he develops that want, but I don't think that's his initial want.
I think very quickly he is so incapable of dealing with his grief for his wife that instead of feeling grief for his wife, he transformed that into a desire to have vengeance against Borden, because that's something he can, in theory, do. Whereas, without talking to Nikola Tesla, the wife's not coming back. I think, if you asked, is devotion enough in Prestige, naturally we would think about Sarah, because, and again, we get sort of a weird answer where, she is very happy with one of her husbands.
Yes.
And the devotion for that husband, even though they aren't always financially successful and they're having whatever chaos in their life, that is enough for her. It's just that she doesn't actually have access. She only has half a devotion.
Yeah.
So is devotion enough? Yes. If you are devoted to something, that thing will succeed. But if you're only half a person, then you don't have a full devotion. And you might be devoted to something that doesn't actually make you happy.
And then for Black Swan, I think this is another question of, what do you actually want? So I think Nina is extremely devoted to ballet. And in the end, she does create the perfect performance. Her dying words are, I felt it was perfect. I just need to point out that in that performance, she started wobbling in the middle of a lift and her partner had to drop her.
Did she mess up that, or was it her partner's fault?
The impression I got was that she did mess that up. He has lifted her up. He's holding her by like the inner thigh and the side of the waist. She's up in an arabesque. And he's spinning her around slowly. And she is looking at the corps who's dancing around them, the corps de ballet, and sees Lily. And that sort of throws her off. And then there's all these shots of her, like her head sort of swimming and of his hands trying to hold her up, but she's sort of wobbling. And so I think we are meant to interpret that as she is letting Lily get into her head, and it's making her too difficult to hold. So aside from the fact that this was not a perfect performance, she is completely dedicated and is willing
She does turn into a swan.
Destroy her body or allow her body to be destroyed in order to have the perfect performance. And so she gets, and at the beginning, Nina keeps saying, I just want to be perfect. She tells that to Thomas. She tells that to her mother. So Lily does actually get what she wants because of her devotion.
Yes.
I think the rest of us wouldn't want that. So it's not super applicable to the audience.
I think we're led to believe she dies happy.
Yeah. So I think we're also getting a yes, but a different takeaway for the audience from Black Swan.
One point in common, one shared theme that I have thought about is that the films try to present, I think, some tricky ethical questions. Like in Amadeus, we have the question of, okay, is it just for Mozart to have this? And is Salieri's anger at God, or maybe even his act of vengeance, justified? Or maybe, is there, what's Salieri's way out? And in the Prestige, we have the question of, Angier does have some reason to conclude that Borden is responsible for the death of his wife, and death of his wife. And by movie rules, that means he has right to vengeance. And so we know we have to wrestle with that question. And then for Nina in Black Swan, we have this hard question of, okay, you are someone who has a lot of talent, and you can feel yourself cracking and building towards this breakdown, and you tell yourself, let me just hold on for a little while, get through this project I'm trying to achieve, and then I'll value self-care.
Yeah.
And so is that acceptable? Is that unacceptable? So, to me, then that makes me want to say, well, let's try to answer all these questions. So for Salieri, what is the right thing for Salieri to do here when he realizes that it's actually this person he considers horrible that's been given the gift? And I have the answer.
Yeah.
What he should have done is he should have asked for Mozart's help. Salieri and Mozart could have become, at least in this version told in the story, could have become some amazing composing duo where they work together, and maybe Salieri could learn enough from working for Mozart that he could end up surpassing him. That does happen. But
I don't think that is presented as a possibility, because Mozart actually is disdainful of Salieri. I don't think if Mozart was hired as a tutor for Salieri, which I don't think Salieri would actually do because that would be too humiliating for him, Mozart wouldn't actually take the instructions seriously. He doesn't think Salieri has it in him to be a good composer. And we repeatedly see Mozart be disdainful of other composers. Whenever another composer is mentioned as like someone who might be deserving of patronage from the emperor, Mozart says they're crap. And Salieri, even after he has ostensibly helped Mozart put on the ballet of Marriage of Figaro, Salieri invites Mozart. So Mozart should be at his most.
Does Mozart know that Salieri has helped him with that process?
So he asked Salieri for help. Salieri said he would help.
Oh, yeah.
He then doesn't help. But help accidentally happens. So right when we think
big Tesla energy there.
Right when we think Mozart should be at his most grateful to Salieri, Salieri invites Mozart to his own opera, and Mozart can't even lie and say something nice about the opera.
He does try.
But he completely fails.
Okay.
And Salieri can tell that he's denigrating his work.
But he and Mozart aren't collaborators. Eventually, they do kind of become collaborators on the Death Mass, and they do establish something of a constructive working relationship.
I actually think they don't. We see Mozart describing the music that he wants Salieri to write down. And at a certain point, Salieri says, "You go too fast," or "I don't understand." And we see, up to that point, we've seen the music flowing out of Mozart. We're listening to it play as he's talking. And then it goes silent when Salieri needs more time.
Sure.
So they are not effectively collaborating. Salieri is too slow for Mozart.
Right now. But I think if Salieri had approached that relationship with the sense of humility, I think part of what Mozart is reacting to is that he can tell that Salieri really is not actually, doesn't have any care for Mozart and is coming to him from a position of power, trying to instruct Mozart on what Mozart should be doing.
In the final scene.
Not in the final scene. I'm talking about early on in the movie. Okay. So I believe that there is an avenue that Salieri could have taken where he says, okay, this is God's gift to me. God has given to me the world's most talented person who, for good or for bad, has been forced to become my professional ally, and he really wants to have a good relationship with Salieri. I'm going to exploit that situation not by killing Mozart, but by using this to make myself a better composer. And at least he could have achieved his goal much more than he actually did by trying to kill Mozart. Getting vengeance against Mozart maybe would have gotten him the acclaim he wanted. I think he would always know that acclaim is hollow. So he could have chosen a constructive relationship and could have gained a lot from it.
Another thing he could have chosen, it's slightly ambiguous what his initial wish is. Is his initial wish that he, Salieri, can create beautiful music in praise of God, or that beautiful music in praise of God exist? Because he certainly, if he had championed Mozart as opposed to pretending to champion Mozart through the imperial court, Mozart could have composed a lot more music.
I think he would have been happier as Mozart's ally. And that, exactly where he would have come out in the order of things, if that wasn't his priority, if his priority was not about being the best, but about, I want to break through as an artist and I want to create next level music. Well, here's your opportunity to learn how to create next level music. And your response is, I'm going to kill the guy who could teach me how to do this. So for the Prestige, I feel like we have to give some credence to this, to movie logic, and say if somebody kills your wife, then you need to get vengeance, or maybe, I don't know, we have to wrestle with that question. So either Angier should have just killed Borden. And if vengeance is the right thing to do, okay, do your vengeance thing and accept the consequences from that. And then go on and live your life. Or he could have just let Borden go and tried to be a magician. Yeah, he clearly had more skill as a stage performer than Borden did, and likely would have ended up being a more successful magician in the show business industry if he had just left Borden alone and not constantly been sabotaged by him. So, I don't know that there's as weird of an answer there as we might have in Amadeus, but I do think that there is actually a pretty simple moral answer, which is either kill him or move on, the classic Hamlet dilemma. For Black Swan, it's really tricky because we have someone who is going through a breakdown and we can't really, in some ways, hold fully responsible for their actions. That's the one where I do think it's trickier. This is something that I find myself really struggling with, where I want to create things, I want to do important things, I want to succeed, and I say, well, okay, I'm not going to take care of myself, I'm just going to do this more, and then once that's done, and once I'm finished, then I'm actually go around and start making responsible decisions, and that just leads to me taking on more things, and at that point not actually coming. So, I don't know, this one is harder for me to deal with. In a way, I think we can say that, Natalie Portman is a really innocent person who hasn't really been prepared for these issues in life.
Nina Sayers.
Yes, Nina Sayers, and she doesn't know how to deal with this rivalry with Mila, and, she doesn't know how long it takes for MDMA to wear off, and so she's putting herself in a lot of bad situations. So I don't know there if the answer is just make more responsible choices. In a way, I think that's the character that I have the most sympathy for sure.
And now it is a month later, and it sounds like we haven't been recording for 3 hours, which is great for everyone. And we're going to tell you about next month's movies. And both of these films have very particular titles that often get abbreviated. So, David, what are the official titles of next episode's films?
Okay, so we are doing Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio from 2022. And we are doing A.I. Artificial Intelligence from 2001.
You included the punctuation.
Just to be clear, there's no colon. So it's Pinocchio episode.